What time is it where you are? Over here, it's just past 11 on a rainy April night. The tin roof above my porch hums softly with the steady tap of rain, and the old wooden clock in my kitchen just let out its deep, slow chime. I find myself thinking about Wyoming, back in 1949, where sheep bells rang across the misty fields and childhood drifted by like rain sliding down the window pane. Maybe you can't sleep tonight. Neither can I. So let me tell you a few memories. Not the big kind, just the small ones. The kind that stay with you, quiet and stubborn, like a favorite old sweater you never quite pack away. Maybe they'll feel familiar to you. Or maybe they'll be as strange as a faded photo left in someone else's drawer. But either way, if you're lying awake, then let my voice take you back to a different time, a different place. A place where the sheep still come home in the rain and folks still brew tea before bed. It always starts with the sound of rain on wool, not on the roof, not on the windows, but on wool. It's a sound you'd miss if you weren't listening closely. Thick, earthy, quiet. Like the land itself was sighing under the weight of water. When I hear that sound, I go back to our ranch in Carbon County, Wyoming. Spring, 1949. I was 8 years old. The war had been over for a few years, but out where we lived, time moved slower than the rest of the country. Sometimes I think it still does. Our ranch wasn't big, just 75 acres of stubborn soil, a weathered red barn, and a creaky house with chipped white paint that peeled like birch bark in the wind. We had 64 sheep, 3 cows, 2 chickens who refused to lay, and a dog named Sugar who was afraid of thunder. The nearest neighbor was a mile down the dirt road, a man named Vernon who smoked corn cob pipes and taught his parrot to swear in German. The town of Rawlins sat 20 miles off, but we only went in every other Saturday to stock up on flour, coffee, and the occasional bag of lemon drops for us kids. My father, Walter, was a tall man with hands like oak roots, thick, knotted, and strong. He was born on that same ranch, raised by his own father, who'd lost most of his hearing in the Great War and all of his kindness in the Depression. By the time I was old enough to remember, Pa had settled into a quiet rhythm. He rose before dawn every day, fed the animals, checked the fences, mended whatever had broken in the night, always something, and never once complained about the cold or the mud or the ache in his back. He was the kind of man who said more in a nod than others said in paragraphs. My mother, Ellen, was softer, but not by much. She grew up in a mining town and had the lungs to prove it. Could call you in from half a mile away, and you'd hear it in your bones. But she loved her tea, especially in the evenings. Every night at exactly 9, she'd brew a pot and drink it out of her favorite chipped blue mug, the one with the faded painting of a fox that she claimed looked like her grandmother. She kept a small journal, or ledger, really. Just a ruled notebook she stored in the kitchen drawer, where she logged the weather, the harvests, and all the little odd things that make a life. 1 page per month. April 1949 was her rainiest entry ever. 22 days of drizzle, downpour, or outright storms. She marked them with blue dots, and that page looked like it had caught the measles. I had an older brother, Henry, who was 11 that year and fancying himself a cowboy. He wore a belt too big and boots too small, and he tried to ride anything with 4 legs, sheep included. Most days, he helped Pa with the heavier chores, hauling feed, digging post holes, herding the sheep back when they wandered too far up the hill. He had more energy than sense, and more freckles than either of us could count. But he was good to me, mostly. As for me, I was the sheep counter. That was my job. Every evening before supper, Ma would hand me a small notepad and say, "Don't miss any, Clara." And off I'd go, out into the pasture in my oversized raincoat that made me look like a walking potato sack, boots sloshing in the soaked ground, counting aloud. 1, 2, 3. All the way to 64. I'd learned all their names too. Ma thought naming them was foolish, said we'd be eating some come fall. But I didn't care. I whispered their names like prayers. Peach, Cinnamon, Old Larkspur, Button, Aunt Ruth. Aunt Ruth was a real kicker in both senses, named after Ma's sister, and just as moody. One night, April 18th, I still remember, it rained harder than usual, harder even than the thunderstorm that knocked out our phone line the year before. The wind shook the shutters like someone trying to get in, and the fields turned into dark, sloshing seas. I couldn't sleep. Henry was already out cold, snoring into his pillow like a piglet in a feed sack. So I crept down the hall in my nightgown, the floor cold under my toes, and found Ma sitting at the kitchen table. She hadn't gone to bed either. Her hands were wrapped around her mug like she was keeping a bird warm, and she was staring out the window as if waiting for something. She didn't seem surprised to see me, just pushed out the chair across from her and said, "Couldn't sleep?" I shook my head. We sat like that for a while. The only sounds were the rain on the roof and the ticking of the wall clock, slow and steady like a heartbeat. Then Ma turned to me and said something odd. "You ever listen to the rain inside the sheep?" I blinked at her. "The what?" She smiled, that soft, sideways smile that only came out when she was about to say something that made no sense, but somehow always felt true. "You'll see. Go sit with them for a while. Keep your coat on." So I did. I pulled my slicker over my gown, tugged on my boots, and stepped out into the storm. The barn was warm in the way only barns can be, thick with the smell of hay, manure, wet wood, and fleece. The sheep were already huddled close, murmuring to one another in their quiet, muffled way. I slid into the straw near the corner, pulled my hood back, and listened. It took a minute, but then I heard it. The rain wasn't just outside, it was inside. Inside the barn, yes, but deeper. Inside the sheep. Their wool, soaked and steaming, seemed to echo with the sound of rain. A soft, pulsing rhythm, like water breathing. Like the earth itself had curled up with them and was exhaling, slow and steady. I sat there a long time, head resting against a wooden post, the warmth of them all around me. I wasn't scared. I wasn't cold. I wasn't even really awake, not in the usual sense. I was just there, fully there, listening. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, not remembering how I'd gotten there. Ma didn't mention it, just poured me oatmeal and smiled in that knowing way. And years later, when she passed and we were sorting through her things, I found that old ledger, April 18th, one blue dot. And next to it, in her neat looping script, Clara sat with the flock tonight, said she could hear the rain breathing. I don't know if I really said it. Maybe she made it up. Maybe I dreamed it all. But I can still hear it, even now. That gentle, wool-wrapped sound of the world exhaling in the dark. That was the night I stopped being afraid of the rain. And whenever I find myself lying awake, like tonight, I just close my eyes and go back there, to the barn, to the sheep, to the rain inside the wool. And I listen. The rain had been falling for days again, slow, stubborn, and bone deep. The kind that turns gravel roads into gray rivers and makes you think twice before stepping off the porch. I was still 8 years old that spring. The year was 1949, and it was one of those weeks where the whole house seemed to shrink. Everything felt closer when it rained like that, the ceiling a little lower, the floorboards a little louder, the kitchen warmer but somehow smaller, like the walls were breathing in. I remember the day clearly because it was a Friday. Ma always baked bread on Fridays, and the whole house smelled like flour and wood smoke and a little bit of salt. She'd set the dough out on the Hoosier cabinet near the window and cover it with a flour sack towel that once belonged to her grandmother. The radio, a walnut-colored Philco with big gold knobs, played softly in the corner, mostly static, with little bursts of news from Cheyenne, if the clouds didn't muffle the signal too much. Pa had gone out early that morning, wearing his oilskin coat and wool hat, the kind with the ear flaps he only pulled down when the wind screamed across the fields. Henry, my older brother, was in the barn helping patch up the south wall. Again. The boards kept warping from the damp. And me? I was sitting cross-legged on the braided rug by the wood stove, trying to untangle a ball of twine we used for tagging lambs, when I looked up and noticed it. The lantern was missing from the window. Now, that might not sound like much to someone listening now, but back then, every family on our stretch of road kept a kerosene lantern in the front window on stormy days. It was just something you did, a way to say, "We're here, keep going," in case someone got lost or stranded or just needed a warm place to knock, the kind of small-town safety net that didn't need explaining. And that lantern, our lantern, had been sitting in that same window for as long as I could remember. Its base was green metal, dented on one side from when Henry dropped it, chasing a grasshopper, and the glass had a little crack near the top that made the light flicker like a candle. But now it was gone. I stood up, left the twine in a heap, and walked to the window. Sure enough, the oil lamp was gone from the sill. The rain had blurred the outside world into gray shapes, but through the mist, I could just make out Ma's shape walking toward the barn. Umbrella in one hand, the lantern in the other. I didn't know why she'd taken it. I waited for her to come back, but she didn't. Not for a long while. And something about that made me nervous in a way I couldn't explain. When she finally returned, she looked wet, tired, and quiet. She hung her coat by the stove, lit the lantern again, and set it gently back on the sill like it had never left. Then she started kneading the dough without saying a word. Later that night, after supper, meatloaf, canned green beans, and cornbread from yesterday. We sat around the table playing rummy by the yellow glow of that very lantern. Henry kept trying to cheat by drawing 2 cards at once, and Ma kept pretending not to notice. Pa smoked his pipe, the sweet kind with cherry tobacco, and let out one of his rare chuckles when I beat Henry for the second round. Everything seemed normal again, but just before I went to bed, I saw Ma standing by the window, her hand resting gently on the lantern. She looked like she was listening to something far away. It wasn't until years later, when I was old enough to understand more than I asked, that I pieced it together. That afternoon, while Pa was out by the far creek, his horse had spooked on the slick trail and thrown him down a short ravine. He was hurt, nothing broken, thank the Lord, but bruised and stunned and stuck. It was raining too hard for anyone to hear him, and his whistle had gone unheard in the roar of the wind. But somehow, Sugar, our old dog, had come tearing back to the house, barking like mad. And Ma, sharp as ever, had known something wasn't right. She grabbed the lantern without a word, marched through the storm in her house shoes, and followed Sugar straight to him. She never told us that night. Not even Pa did. I don't know if they didn't want to scare us, or if, like so many things back then, it was just understood that not everything needed to be said aloud. Some things were carried in silence, like a loaf of bread rising in a quiet kitchen, or a cracked glass lantern still burning through the rain. The next morning, the storm finally broke. I remember waking up to sunlight creeping across the quilt at the foot of my bed, and the sound of birds for the first time in days. Pa was already out in the pasture, his gait a little slower, his ribs wrapped tight in Ma's old dish towel. But he was whistling, off-key, but happy, and the lantern was still in the window, catching the morning light like it had a secret. That was the day I learned not all heroes ride in on horses. Sometimes they wear aprons and carry lanterns through the mud without waiting to be asked. And every time I see a light burning in a window on a stormy night, I think of Ma, her back straight, her jaw set, and the rain beating off her umbrella like 1,000 tiny drums playing the quietest song of love I ever heard. The third week of May that year, the rain stopped just long enough to make us hopeful, and then started again the moment Pa said, "Looks like it's letting up." It was the kind of rain that didn't come in sheets or storms, but just sat there in the air, like a wet sweater draped over the world. Everything stayed damp. The porch steps turned green. The barn smelled like warm mushrooms. Even Ma's bread took twice as long to rise. And while the grown-ups huffed and groaned and wiped their feet 20 times a day, I loved it, because it meant I got to visit Grandpa Otis. Otis wasn't my real grandpa, not by blood, but he might as well have been. He was Ma's stepfather from way back, lived alone in a log cabin down the bend, near the tree line where the pines started crowding in. His cabin was small, no bigger than a freight car, but he kept it warm with a potbelly stove and filled it with every kind of smell you could imagine: tobacco, bacon grease, pine soap, and something that always reminded me of burnt sugar. He wasn't like Pa. Pa was steady, grounded, practical. Otis was, well, he once tried to train a squirrel to deliver mail. Said the postal system was too slow. He carved wooden birds from firewood, wore socks that didn't match, and kept a loaded slingshot by the window, just in case the raccoons get ideas. And every time I came to visit, he'd hand me a peppermint from a tin so old the label had worn off. That tin. That's what this story's about. It was raining that Tuesday afternoon, the kind that made the world blurry and quiet. Ma was trying to sew a button onto Pa's Sunday shirt. Henry was playing with nails again. He called it a catapult, but it was mostly just dangerous. And I was bored enough to braid twine into pretend snakes. That's when Ma said the magic words. "Why don't you walk down to Otis's and see if he needs anything?" She didn't need to say it twice. I grabbed my coat, my boots, and a tin of leftover corn muffins as a peace offering, and headed down the muddy path. The woods were dripping, alive with sound, the kind you only hear if you walk slow enough. Fat raindrops plopping off pine needles, the soft creak of wet branches, and somewhere, far off, the lonely chime of a wind bell swinging from Otis's porch. When I got there, he was already waiting. Door open, pipe in mouth, wearing his brown suspenders and the red plaid shirt he swore brought him luck at checkers. "You bring the muffins?" he asked, before saying hello. I nodded. "Fresh yesterday." He held out his hand, took the tin, and sniffed it like a bloodhound. "Acceptable," he said. Then he grinned. "Now, come in and sit down. Got something to show you." Inside was warm and smoky. A kettle hissed on the stove, and the walls were lined with shelves of odds and ends. Tin soldiers, bird feathers, glass bottles, a cracked snow globe from Chicago, and dozens of old coffee cans filled with buttons, nails, marbles, and matchbooks. But what caught my eye was the small round tobacco tin on the table. Dented, scratched, with a faded gold lid that looked like it had been in someone's pocket for years. "This here," Otis said, tapping the tin with one finger, "holds the most important thing I own." I raised an eyebrow. "More important than your bird carvings?" He gave me a look. "Birds can't do what this can." He opened the tin slowly, theatrically, and inside was a folded piece of paper. "Now, I know what you're thinking. Not treasure. Not a rare coin or a spy letter from the war. Just paper." But Otis unfolded it with such care, you'd think it was the Declaration of Independence. He handed it to me. "Read that out loud." I looked down. The handwriting was crooked, old-fashioned. It said, "When the world feels too loud, find the pine that splits 3 ways. Sit with your back to its westmost arm and listen. You'll hear the one you miss." I read it twice, maybe 3 times, then looked up. "What does it mean?" Otis sat back, puffed on his pipe. "It's a message to myself," he said. "Wrote it during the war, when I thought I might not come back. Hid it in this very tin. Buried it under that pine it talks about. Dug it up 10 years later, and now I keep it close. For the days when I miss people I can't talk to anymore." I was quiet. At 8, you don't always understand loss, but you understand missing. I missed my friend Annie, who'd moved to Laramie. I missed our dog Daisy, who died 2 winters back. I missed summer, even though it was barely spring. I folded the paper, slower this time, and handed it back. Otis smiled, but his eyes looked far away. "Someday, you'll have a tin, too. Could be for letters, could be for buttons, could be for things you can't say out loud." We didn't talk much after that. He poured us both a mug of hot cider, mine with cinnamon, his with something stronger, and we played dominoes until the sun dipped behind the trees. The rain had stopped when I left, and the sky had that clear, washed look, like it had been scrubbed clean. As I walked back home, the mud squished under my boots, and the smell of wet pine followed me all the way. That night, I found an old matchbox and tucked a folded paper into it. It didn't say anything deep, just a list of all the things I wanted to grow up and do. Be a teacher, ride a horse fast, learn to whistle, visit Chicago. And next to it, I added a peppermint from Otis's tin. Just in case, I still have that box. And Otis's tin, too. He gave it to me the year I turned 16, after he'd gotten too weak to chop his own firewood and started calling people by the wrong names. He didn't remember the note anymore, but I did. And I still do. And whenever the rain falls soft, like it did that May Day in '49, I find myself reaching for it. Not to open it, just to hold it. Feel the weight of memory in my hand. And listen. You wouldn't think a washing machine could cause that much trouble, but it did. And every time I hear the sound of rain hitting a tin roof, I still think of that afternoon. Wyoming, 1949, when the laundry room turned into a lagoon and Ma said words I'm still not allowed to repeat. Let me back up a bit. Before 1949, Ma had always done the laundry by hand. A tin tub, a washboard, and a pair of wrinkled red knuckles that could scare the dirt clean out of anything. I used to sit beside her on laundry day, dipping socks in and out of the soapy water like tea bags, while she sang old hymns under her breath. But Pa, always the practical dreamer, decided it was time to modernize the house. So that April, after much saving and a little help from a cousin in Casper, who knew a guy, we became the proud, slightly confused own, ours of a second-hand electric washing machine. Now, don't imagine the sleek, white machines of today. This thing looked like a cross between a steel drum and a milk churn. It was round, heavy, and had a wringer on top with 2 rubber rollers and a crank so stiff Pa had to oil it twice before it budged. It was made by Maytag, though the M had long since worn off, so we just called it the A-tag and let it be. Ma didn't trust it. Machines don't know stains like hands do, she said. But I think part of her was curious. So on the first clear-ish Thursday after 3 days of drizzle, she decided to give it a try. The laundry room was just off the back porch, a tiny space with wooden slats for walls and a concrete floor that sloped ever so slightly, something we never thought twice about until it was too late. Henry, my older brother, was tasked with running the extension cord from the kitchen window. He did so with the glee of someone lighting a rocket. I was in charge of testing the ringer, which mostly involved putting my hand in and pretending to scream. Ma didn't laugh. The machine rumbled to life with a hum like a tractor in a bad mood. It shook so hard the floorboards vibrated, and for a moment I thought it might hop out the door and take off down the pasture. But it stayed put, chugging and swishing like a giant steel stomach. Everything went fine until we realized we'd forgotten something important. The drainage hose, more specifically, the other end of it. You see, we'd attached the rubber drain pipe to the side of the washer, but no one had figured out where the water was supposed to go. Pa had intended to run the hose through the floor into a small ditch he'd dug, but the rain had made the ground too soft. And so, as a temporary fix, Henry had simply dropped the hose behind the washer and said, "It'll find its way." It did, right across the floor, under the flour sack curtain, and straight into the hallway. Ma noticed it first, her feet suddenly sloshing in warm, soapy water. She looked down, then up, then at the washer, which was still happily gurgling and shaking. "Oh, for heavens," she started, and I won't finish the sentence, but let's just say she invented a few compound words I'd never heard before. Within minutes, the back half of the house looked like Noah had missed our address by 1 inch. Towels were floating. A pair of Pa's long johns sailed past like a ghost ship. The dog barked, Henry shouted, and Ma waded through the suds like a general charging into battle. Eventually, Pa came in, took one look, and said, "It works then." That earned him a look from Ma that could curdle milk. We spent the rest of the afternoon mopping up the mess with every rag, sheet, and curtain we owned. I actually thought it was fun, like some grand adventure. I remember using a soup ladle to bail out the lowest corner of the floor, and Henry tried to surf on a cookie sheet until he knocked over the coal bin. The machine was unplugged and banished to the barn for a full week. Ma went back to her washboard, muttering about electric devils and city nonsense. But then, little by little, she started using it again. First for pillowcases, then for socks, and finally, grudgingly, for everything. Eventually, she even called it helpful. That was as close to a compliment as machines ever got from her. Looking back, I think that day was about more than just a faulty hose. It was about change, about how the world was starting to shift, even out on the edges of nowhere. Radios were getting smaller, cars faster. People talked about color television like it was already here, though no one we knew had seen one. And machines, noisy, rattling, unpredictable things, were creeping into kitchens and barns and laundry rooms, asking to be trusted. Ma never stopped being cautious around that washer. She'd still hum her hymns while it ran, like she was keeping it calm. And she always stood near it, as if watching an animal that might bolt. But she let it stay. She let it help. And that's how I remember that spring. Not just for the rain, not just for the mess, but for the moment our house learned to hum along with something new. It was a Tuesday night, toward the end of May, when the rain fell harder than usual, not in steady drops or soft mist, but sideways, wild, like the sky had turned into a wrung-out mop. I was still 8 that year, and the house had gone quiet after supper. Henry had fallen asleep on the floor reading Boy's Life. Ma was knitting a new dishcloth in her rocking chair, and Pa sat at the table oiling the hinges of the barn lanterns. Every so often he'd test them with a soft creak and nod to himself, as if to say, "Still got it." I was near the front window, tracing little raindrops as they slid down the glass, trying to guess which one would reach the bottom first, when I heard it. 3 knocks, not loud, not rushed, just calm, clear, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. We didn't get visitors on rainy nights, not out where we lived, 4 miles from the main road, and a good 12 from the nearest cafe. And we didn't keep the porch light on either, just the lantern in the window, glowing soft and yellow like a promise. "If you need help, knock." Pa rose first, not fast, but deliberate. He set down the oiled rag, took the shotgun off the wall, not in alarm, but in routine, and opened the front door with that signature Wyoming caution that says, "I'll give you a chance, but don't try anything funny." There, on the porch, stood a man in a brown felt hat, his coat soaked through, boots caked in wet clay, and a black suitcase hanging from one hand like a waterlogged dog. He looked about 30, maybe a little older, with sharp cheekbones and kind eyes that didn't match his tired face. He removed his hat as soon as Pa opened the door. "Evening," he said. Pa said nothing at first, just eyed the man, then the rain behind him, then the road that stretched invisible past the trees. "I'm headed to Cheyenne," the man added, "but my truck died back near Elk Run. Nothing but wet wires and a cussing engine. I saw your light." Still, Pa said nothing. Then Ma stood up behind him, calm as a spring creek. "Come in before you drown," she said, and just like that, the moment passed. The stranger stepped in. He left muddy prints on the entry rug, but no one cared. Ma handed him a towel and poured him a cup of coffee from the stove, the old percolator kind, with grounds that snuck through the spout no matter how carefully you poured. The man drank it like it was the first warm thing he'd seen in days. "My name's Charles," he said. "Charles Alden. I'm a field surveyor. Just finished some soil mapping north of here. My truck's temperamental in good weather. In this, it's more like a boat with wheels." Ma smiled. "We don't see many surveyors with suitcases." Charles looked down at the bag. "That's not maps," he said. "That's my mother's pie tin." Now I didn't know what to expect him to say, but that sure wasn't it. "She passed in January," he explained. "Didn't leave much, but she made rhubarb pie every Sunday, no matter how bad the week was. When she died, I took the tin. Been carrying it with me ever since. Helps me feel like I still know where home is." There was a long silence after that, but not the awkward kind. The kind that comes when someone said something so soft, you don't want to move too quickly and scare it off. We offered him the guest cot by the stove, a fold-out thing Pa had made years before using scrap wood and parts from an old crib. It creaked like a barn door, but held steady. Charles laid his coat out by the fire, placed the suitcase gently beside him, and thanked us with the kind of voice people use when they don't take kindness for granted. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear the rain on the roof, the occasional hiss of wind through the windows, and the gentle creak of that cot as Charles turned over. I thought about his pie tin, his quiet voice, the way Pa had slowly lowered the shotgun after seeing his eyes. And I thought, for the first time maybe, about all the roads that led to our porch. Roads full of people I'd never meet, carrying strange burdens and old memories, just hoping for one more knock answered. By morning, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and Ma made pancakes. thick, fluffy, slightly burned on the edges the way Pa liked them. Charles joined us at the table, still damp, still quiet, but with a little more color in his face. He didn't eat much, but he ate slow, like every bite was part of a prayer. Before he left, Pa helped him drain the engine, dry the distributor cap, and wrap the wires in burlap from the feed sacks. We all stood by the fence as he turned the key, and the truck, a rusted International harvester, coughed to life like it had simply needed to rest. Charles shook Pa's hand, tipped his hat to Ma, and then, this part I remember most, he turned to me, crouched to eye level, and said, "Thank you for the quiet. Sometimes that's all a man needs." Then he drove off into the mist, the red of his tail light blinking once before the trees swallowed it. We never saw him again, but Ma washed the towel he'd used and folded it like company was still expected. And the rug kept his muddy print for nearly a year, no matter how much baking soda we used. Even now, when I hear a knock on a rainy night, I think of Charles. I think of the pie tin. I think of how kindness doesn't need much. Just a towel, a cup of coffee, and a place to dry your boots. And a lantern in the window. It wasn't supposed to rain that afternoon. The sky had been clear all morning, the clouds soft and high like whipped cream spread too thin. Even Ma had taken the laundry out, something she never did unless she was sure. But Wyoming has its own mind about weather, and by 2 in the afternoon, the air shifted. The smell changed first, less like dust and hay, more like metal and something wild. The kind of smell that makes the cows get twitchy and the dogs stick close to the porch. That was the day Pa decided we should fix the north fence. It had sagged in the last storm, and the ewes were getting too bold. Henry was off helping Vernon with a calf birth, so Pa looked at me and said, "Come on, bring gloves." He didn't say much more than that. Pa wasn't a man of speeches. You had to learn to read his eyebrows, his boots, his esses, ilenses. But when he asked you to come along, you came. Especially when you were 8, and hoping he might let you hammer something. We took the Ford pickup, green and rusted, with a bench seat that squeaked no matter how careful you sat. Pa let me ride up front, even rolled the window down a crack so I could feel the breeze. We bounced over the pasture road, the truck grumbling with every rut, and stopped near the split cedar post that marked the far edge of the north line. Fixing fence was slow work. Pa had a rhythm: tap the wire, adjust the tension, check the staple, grunt once if it was good, twice if not. I handed him nails, held boards straight, and tried not to get poked by the barbs. At one point, he let me hammer in a corner post bracket, and even though it went in a little crooked, he just nodded once and moved on. That was the closest thing to praise I ever got from Pa. A nod that said, "You didn't mess it up too bad." We were halfway through the last section when the wind dropped. Not stopped, dropped, like someone had opened a door in the sky and sucked the sound right out. Pa looked up. The clouds had thickened into bruises. The light was turning that eerie color, the kind between green and gold, that only happens before bad rain. "Grab the tools," he said, already tossing wire and gloves into the crate. We got in the truck just as the first drops hit the windshield, heavy, cold, and fast. And that's when the engine didn't start. Pa tried once, twice, nothing. Just a sad little choke. Then silence. He muttered something under his breath, not angry, just resigned. Then he looked over at me. "Guess we're walking." We were a little over a mile from the house, but the rain had other plans. It didn't fall. It dropped, like buckets being poured straight from the clouds. Within minutes, the road turned to soup. Our boots stuck with every step. I kept slipping, and Pa finally reached down and hoisted me up with one hand, setting me on his hip like I was 4 again. I remember being embarrassed, but also relieved. The warmth of his flannel shirt, the steady sound of his breathing, the way his fingers wrapped around my side, not tight, but firm, protective. About halfway home, we came across the old hay wagon Pa had abandoned the year before. The wheels had sunk deep into the mud, and Ma had been telling him to haul it off for months. But now, it was shelter. Pa ducked under the back, still holding me, and set me down on the wooden floor. The rain drummed on the tin roof above like 1,000 tiny hooves. It was dark, but not scary, just dim, like the inside of a barn before sunrise. Pa leaned back against one of the wagon rails and sighed. I sat beside him, knees pulled up, water dripping from my braids. And then, maybe it was the rain, maybe it was the quiet. He started talking. He told me about his first storm out here, 1927. He was 13, herding cattle alone, when lightning struck a tree less than 20 feet away. Said he couldn't hear straight for a week. He talked about his father, my granddad, who never said, "I love you," but once carved Pa a wooden horse when he was sick with the flu. He said Ma made the best apple pie he'd ever tasted, but burned scrambled eggs like it was her calling. He talked in full sentences, whole stories, and I just listened, heart thudding, afraid to move in case he stopped. After a while, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a peppermint. Dry, slightly cracked. Handed it to me without a word. I unwrapped it slowly, let it melt on my tongue, and leaned against his arm. We must have sat there a good hour, just listening to the rain and the soft creak of the wagon. Eventually, the storm passed. The light returned, pale and clean, and the smell of wet earth rose around us like steam. Pa stood, stretched, and offered me his hand. I took it, and we walked home in the golden quiet that only comes after a storm. That night, Ma asked why we were soaked to the bone. Pa just said, "Truck quit, wagon worked." He never mentioned the stories, never brought up the peppermint or the way he carried me through the mud. But I remembered. I still do. And whenever life gets loud, too loud, I close my eyes and go back to that wagon. The rain, the steady warmth of my father's hand, and the moment a man who spoke so little finally let the field turn into sky and said everything I needed to hear. Rainy mornings on the ranch didn't start with roosters. They started with the drip, drip, drip of water off the roof into the metal bucket Ma kept by the back door. If the drip had rhythm, you knew it was a light day. If it sounded like someone playing drums with spoons, you knew you'd better forget the laundry and just stay inside. That morning was definitely the spoon kind. It was early June 1949, and I was still 8 years old, though I'd been telling people I was almost 9 since April. The rain had come hard during the night, and by breakfast time it was still coming down in thick silver sheets. The sheep weren't moving. The dog was hiding under the table. The porch had sprouted a puddle the size of Nebraska, and everyone in the house looked, well, trapped. Usually, Ma would have just pulled out a jar of peach preserves and made toast for breakfast. But that morning she had a headache and declared she was off duty until further notice. Pa was fixing the hinges on the woodshed door, which somehow made more noise than the door itself, and I had already read every page of Little Annie Oakley 3 times that week. So Henry, my 11-year-old brother and part-time cowboy, declared that he would make breakfast. Now, to be clear, Henry had never successfully made anything other than messes. The last time he'd helped in the kitchen, he dropped 2 eggs, 3 forks, and somehow set a tea towel on fire just by looking at it. But that didn't stop him from puffing out his chest and announcing, "I'm making pancakes. Big ones." I watched Ma raise one eyebrow, sigh, and wave her hand like she was giving a Viking permission to sail into a storm. "Fine," she said. "The flour's in the bin. Don't break the stove." And so began the great pancake incident of 1949. Henry got to work like a man on a mission. He measured out the flour with a cracked teacup, dumped in milk without checking if it was still good, and added 3 eggs with the enthusiasm of someone playing baseball. For flavor, he threw in a pinch of salt, a glug of something that looked like vanilla, and, for fun, half a teaspoon of Ma's cinnamon blend, which she usually reserved for Christmas pies. The batter looked like something between library paste and wall spackle, but Henry was thrilled. "It's got heft," he declared proudly. Then he lit the cast-iron griddle and spooned out a pancake the size of the state of Missouri. We waited, the house filled with the smell of scorched flour and hope. After several minutes of sizzling, poking, and flipping, with 2 spatulas and a fork, the first pancake was done, at least by Henry's definition. It was black on one side, beige on the other, and somehow raw in the middle. He plopped it onto a plate and slid it across the table toward me like a blackjack dealer. I stared at it. It stared back. "Eat it," Henry said. "You're the brave one." Now, I wasn't dumb, but I was curious, so I took one bite. I'll say this. It had texture. Several, in fact. Crunchy, chewy, rubbery, and then something I still can't describe, like the inside of an old suitcase. The cinnamon helped. A little. I chewed very slowly. Pa, who had just walked in from the shed, took one look at my face and said, "Good grief, son. What did you do to her?" "It's pancake," Henry said proudly. "Frontier style." Ma emerged from the bedroom just in time to catch that sentence. She took one look at the kitchen, at the flour on the cat, the batter on the ceiling, and the skillet still smoking on the stove, and said, "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," which, in Ma's speak, meant she was simultaneously amused, horrified, and just barely impressed. In the end, we all sat down and ate Henry's pancakes. Well, one each. Pa slathered his with molasses. I buried mine under so much jam I couldn't taste anything. Ma ate hers with the kind of patience only mothers have, and Henry grinned like he'd just won a prize at the county fair. And you know what? It was a good breakfast. Not because of the pancakes, heaven knows I still get flashbacks, but because of the laughter. The rain kept falling outside, but inside, the house was warm with burnt sugar, loud stories, and the sound of forks scraping plates that probably didn't need scraping at all. That afternoon, Henry cleaned the kitchen under Ma's watchful eye. I helped scrape batter off the light switch. The cat refused to come near us for 3 days, and Ma, in a moment of weakness, actually wrote the recipe down in her ledger under the title, "Henry's Famous Pancakes. Do not make again." Years later, when Ma passed and I found that ledger, I smiled when I saw it. The recipe was still there, just 4 lines and one big warning. And somehow, in that moment, I could smell the burnt edge again, feel the sticky jam on my chin, hear Henry's laugh. Rainy mornings on the ranch never were about getting things done. They were about staying in, messing up, and remembering the sound of joy when everything outside was gray. And between you and me, I've made those pancakes again. Just once. And yes, they were still terrible. But the memory? Delicious. It was a Friday, late June, and the storm had been brewing since lunchtime. You could feel it in your knees before you saw it in the sky. That heavy kind of air that makes you yawn, and the curtains hang stiff, unmoving. Ma said it smelled like rain, but to me it smelled like something was about to happen. By 5 o'clock, the clouds had swallowed the sun whole, and the wind came in from the west like it had somewhere to be. Henry and I were setting the table. Mismatched plates, tin forks, and cloth napkins that Ma always insisted on, even if we were just having bean stew again. Pa was out in the barn making sure the ewes were tucked in, and Ma was slicing onions with her good knife, the one that had a chipped handle and more stories than most people. Then came the flash. A white burst so bright it lit up the whole kitchen like a camera bulb going off. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, crack. The thunder hit like a rifle blast, and right then, as if the whole house had held its breath, the lights blinked once and died. At first, no one moved. Then Henry said, "Uh-oh." And Ma, without missing a beat, wiped her hands and said, "Well, that's that." The power wasn't unusual to lose. Our ranch lines were old, the poles bowed like tired men, and even a stiff wind could knock us off the grid. But when it happened during a storm, that meant we might not get it back till morning. No radio, no stove, no overhead lights. Just shadows and the smell of stew slowly cooling in the pot. Normally, that would have been a cause for complaints or sulking. But that night, something felt different, like the house had softened. Ma lit the oil lamp on the windowsill, the same one she used when I was little and afraid of the dark. Pa came in just after, soaked to the elbows and carrying a bundle of kindling, which he stacked near the stove without a word. His flannel was dripping, his boots squelched, but his face looked calm, comfortable even. I remember sitting on the floor with Henry while Pa struck a match to light the fire. The glow filled the room slowly, as if it were shy. The shadows danced up the walls, and for the first time in a long time, I noticed just how quiet everything was. No buzzing bulbs, no humming fridge, no static from the radio, just wind, rain, and fire. Dinner was served by lantern light, stew, thick and sweet, with leftover cornbread and a jar of Ma's pickled beets. Pa poured water from the jug instead of the tap, and Ma passed out tin mugs like we were picnicking indoors. Henry pretended he was a pioneer. I pretended I was a queen. After dinner, we didn't do the usual things. No rummy, no radio shows, no chores. Instead, Ma brought out a small box from the top shelf of the pantry, one I'd only seen once before, on the night I had the measles. Inside were dominoes, playing cards, a small Bible, a broken harmonica, and 4 little candles that smelled faintly of cinnamon. Henry took the harmonica, of course, and began to play something that sounded vaguely like "She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain" if you squinted your ears hard enough. Pa chuckled. Ma rolled her eyes, and I lit one of the cinnamon candles just to see if it remembered how to shine. It did. Later, we told stories. Ma went first, one about her sister falling into a barrel of sauerkraut when they were young. Pa followed with a tale of his Uncle Bart, who once tried to race a train on horseback and won, technically, though the horse never quite trusted him again. Then it was Henry's turn. He tried to make one up on the spot and ended up with a story about a talking cow and a magic hat. We laughed so hard Ma snorted into her tea. When it was my turn, I didn't have a story, so I just described the room, the glow of the fire, the flicker of candlelight, the way Pa's face looked softer without the overhead glare. I talked about how the windows looked like mirrors and how the outside world had vanished except for the sound of rain on the tin roof. I think I said something like, "It's like the house is glowing from the inside." No one said anything for a moment. Then Ma reached over and squeezed my hand. just once. We all fell asleep in the living room that night. The fire was too warm to leave, and the rest of the house felt too cold to go back to. Ma dozed in her rocker. Henry curled up by the hearth with the dog. Pa stretched out on the couch, one boot still on, and I lay under the quilt, listening to the wind slowly die down and the logs crackle as if telling secrets. The power came back sometime before dawn. I know because the fridge groaned awake and the radio hissed for a second before settling into silence. But no one stirred. The glow of the fire was enough. Years later, I'd live in houses with more switches than windows. I'd have electric clocks, heated floors, microwaves that sang, but none of them ever gave me the peace of that one night when the lights went out, and we lit something much warmer instead. It turns out the brightest moments don't need bulbs, just people, and a little cinnamon wax. It had rained all night. One of those long, deep rains that soaks not just the fields, but the corners of your soul if you let it. When I woke that morning, late June, still 1949, the house smelled of damp wool, cooling ashes, and something else I couldn't place right away. It wasn't a bad smell, just empty, as if someone had stepped out and left a part of them behind. The sheep were quiet that morning, unusually so. Pa noticed it first. He stood by the window, sipping his coffee from the brown enamel mug he never let Ma wash in the sink. "Something's off," he said. Ma looked up from her darning, didn't say anything, but her fingers stilled. The rain had slowed to a gentle mist, and Pa decided to walk the fence line anyway. I tagged along, mostly because I was bored, partly because I wanted to wear my new rubber boots with the little white stars Ma had painted on them. The pasture was soggy and smelled like iron and wet hay, but the birds had started chirping again. Life, as it always does out there, was trying to pick up where it left off. When we reached the rise near the elm grove, I looked across to where Vernon's cabin usually sat like a biscuit dropped in a skillet of green. His porch was empty. Now, Vernon wasn't a man known for punctuality, but he was reliable in his own odd way. He sat on that porch every morning, rain or shine. Same battered chair, same pipe, same wide-brimmed hat tilted over his eyes like a lazy sheriff in a storybook. He waved to us, even if we couldn't see it clearly. Ma once joked that he waved whether anyone was looking or not, just in case someone might be. But that morning, there was no movement, no smoke from his stovepipe, no dim glint from his porch lantern, just stillness. Pa didn't say anything, but I saw his shoulders tighten. We kept walking the fence, checked the southern gate, the posts near the runoff ditch. When we circled back, Vernon's cabin still sat in that quiet way that makes you want to whisper. Pa slowed near the road and finally said, "Go ahead if you want. Take the muffins. They're still warm." The muffins were Ma's raisin and oat kind, the ones she made whenever she said someone might be feeling low but too proud to say so. She'd wrapped them in a dish towel and left them by the door, and I had hoped maybe we'd eat them ourselves. But something in Pa's voice told me the muffins had somewhere else to be. I walked the mile alone, boots squelching, towel-wrapped bundle tucked in my arms like a secret. The rain picked up a little, tapping my coat hood like a curious finger. I didn't mind. I always liked the walk to Vernon's. His cabin smelled like pipe smoke, old books, and the strange mix of loneliness and kindness that only lives in the homes of people who've been quiet too long. When I reached the porch, it was empty, just like before. The rocking chair was still there, damp, unmoving. His dog, Ruby, a red-bone hound older than time, lay curled in the corner, nose under paw. She didn't get up, just wagged her tail once, soft and slow. I knocked. Once, twice, nothing. But the door was open, not wide, just a crack, enough to suggest Vernon was still home, or had been recently. I didn't go in. I wasn't raised that way. But I called out, "Mr. Vernon, it's Clara. Brought muffins." Still nothing. I left the bundle on the step, beside the porch rail where he always set his pipe when it was too hot. And just before I turned to leave, I saw it. On the edge of the porch rail, carved in the wood with a pocket knife I'd seen him carry. Here, even when I'm not. I stared at it for a long while. The rain began to fall harder. Not loud, but steady. I turned toward home. He passed 3 days later. Ma said it was his heart. Pa just nodded and sat on the porch longer that evening. Ruby came to live with us after that. She slept beside the stove and only ever barked at thunder. Henry said she was too quiet, but I liked her that way. We didn't talk much about Vernon after the funeral. The pastor from town came out, read some psalms, and Ma brought lemon cake in one of her good tins. Nobody cried, but nobody looked at each other too long either. But I went back to that porch once, weeks later, on a clear day in July. The carving was still there. Still is, maybe. And even now, when the rain falls soft and the sheep go still, I find myself glancing toward that side of the pasture, toward the porch that once held a man who waved whether anyone could see him or not. And I like to think, when things get quiet and the sky presses down, that somewhere, somehow, Vernon's still sitting there, just in case someone might be. I didn't notice it right away. No one did, not really. It was early July, just after the 4th. There were still a few paper flags taped to the kitchen windows, drooping, gee, from the humidity. Ma hadn't taken them down yet. She said it felt like jinxing the country if you pulled them down too early. Henry said it was because she liked how the red dye bled into the corners like watercolor. I thought maybe she just didn't want the house to feel empty. We'd been living with rain for what felt like forever. 27 days in a row, Ma had counted. A few drizzles, some storms, 2 real downpours that sent water through the back shed and into, the coal bin. Everything we owned was a little damp. Clothes, wood, shoes, books, even the biscuits. Dampness had settled into the bones of the house like a polite guest who didn't know when to leave. That morning started the same as all the others. Pa was already up when I padded into the kitchen barefoot. The stove was cold. The sky outside was still gray, but not heavy. Just quiet. No thunder. No wind. No hiss of rain tapping on the windows. I didn't think much of it. Just figured the storm was catching its breath. Ma was in her house robe, watering the kitchen violets. She didn't say anything at first, then turned and handed me the kettle. "Go check the porch planter," she said. "The one with the snapdragons." I took it without asking. I liked watering things. I liked pretending they noticed me. When I opened the front door, that's when I saw it. Sunlight. It wasn't much. Just a soft golden edge across the pasture, still wet, still sparkling in places like someone had dusted the fields with sugar. But it was there. Real. Quiet. Honest. And the sky, it had turned that bright pale blue, the kind that makes you blink because your eyes forgot how to handle color. I didn't move, didn't speak, just stood barefoot on the porch, water sloshing in the kettle, and listened to nothing. No rain, no dripping, no storm, just bird song. The sheep were awake, milling about, their bells ringing softly like someone had hung music across the fence line. Even the dog had ventured back to his post by the barn door, nose lifted, tail twitching. Everything felt like it had exhaled at the same time. Pa stepped out behind me, quietly, coffee in hand. He looked across the land like a man seeing something he wasn't sure he believed anymore. He nodded once. That was enough. The rest of the day moved slowly, like the house didn't quite know what to do with itself. Henry oiled the hinges on the chicken coop. Ma opened all the windows and beat the rugs like they'd offended her. I spent the afternoon lying in the grass, counting clouds and making stories out of their shapes. A lion chasing a mouse, a canoe with wings, 2 sheep dancing. The kind of stories only kids believe, or remember. That night, the stars came out for the first time in what felt like forever. I remember lying in bed with the window cracked open, letting in the breeze that smelled like wet dirt and pine. The sheep bells had gone quiet. The house creaked in a friendly way, like it was stretching its legs. And from somewhere far off, maybe the river, maybe a coyote, maybe just the wind, came a sound like a song you almost remember. I didn't fall asleep right away. I didn't want to, because that night I knew something was ending. Not big, not loud, just a season, a softness, a stretch of days that had held me gently, even when they soaked my boots and fogged up the windows. The rain had left behind more than puddles. It had left memories. And when I think of that summer now, when I close my eyes and go back, it's not the rain I remember most. It's the after. It's the smell of dry earth daring to believe again. It's Ma humming with the windows open. It's Henry looking up at the sky and saying, "Huh." It's Pa leaving his boots outside because the porch was finally dry. It's the sheep bells ringing not in warning, but in joy. It's me holding a kettle full of water, learning what it means to witness something return. And it's the sound, soft, low, steady, of Wyoming breathing again. Well, that's all I have for tonight. 10 little pieces of a rainy season that's long gone by now, washed away with the mud, folded into memory, and maybe, somehow, still hanging in the rafters of an old red barn in Carbon County, Wyoming. I don't know what kind of day you've had, or why you're still awake, but I hope these stories gave your heart a place to rest, not to forget the world, just to soften its edges a bit. Sometimes, all we really need is a voice in the quiet, a sheep bell in the distance, a window with the lantern still lit. So, wherever you are, city, country, curled up in bed, or just passing time with your headphones on, thank you for sitting with me a while. If you ever feel the rain again, maybe you'll think of the little girl in the pasture, the boy with his terrible pancakes, or the man with the pie tin in his suitcase. And maybe that will be enough. Until next time, sleep well. And don't worry, the porch light's still on. The Frog Pond and the Summer Rains, Tennessee, 1957. I don't know what time it is where you are, but here, it's the kind of midnight that smells like rain on warm dirt. The crickets have started their low chorus, and the wind is brushing past the porch screen like it's got secrets to tell. I've never been much good at sleeping through nights like this, not when the dark feels more like a doorway than a wall. And tonight, well, I thought I'd sit a while, maybe share a few things with someone who can't sleep either. I won't try to fix anything, don't worry. I just figured maybe, if I whispered some pieces of my past out loud, it might help us both remember that we're not the only ones awake. It was the summer of 1957, and I was 10 years old, barefoot more often than not, with freckles that came out like dandelions the moment the sun touched my skin. We lived in a crooked old farmhouse just outside Frog Holler, Tennessee, a place so small that when folks asked where you were from, you had to explain what it was near, not what it was. I used to tell people, it's where the frogs throw concerts every night, and the rain knows your name. They'd laugh, but I wasn't joking. That summer, the air was thick and sweet with honeysuckle and cut grass, and the only thing louder than the cicadas were the screen doors slamming shut every few minutes as kids ran in and out for Kool-Aid or to avoid chores. Our house had a front porch that slanted a little to the left, and whenever it rained hard enough, the water would gather in a shallow puddle near the steps. I used to sit cross-legged by that puddle and watch the raindrops fall into it like dancers, making little rings that overlapped and disappeared before I could count them all. The first storm that summer rolled in on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember it because Mama had just finished wringing out the laundry, and I was under the clothesline trying to catch a fat June bug in my mason jar. The sky turned this soft, purplish gray like bruised linen, and the breeze started to carry that cool, electric smell. It wasn't long before the frogs started singing. You could always tell when the frogs knew it was coming. They'd get louder than usual, like they were trying to beat the thunder to the punch. Sometimes I thought maybe they were praying. That storm didn't just bring rain, it brought a memory I've carried ever since. That was the day I met Denny Ray. He was 12 and a half, which he reminded you of constantly, like it made him practically an adult. He'd just moved in down the road to live with his great-uncle Earl, a retired tobacco farmer with one good leg and a laugh that sounded like a broken banjo. Folks said something hush-hush happened with Denny's folks in Memphis. Trouble with the law, maybe, or worse. Nobody ever got the full story. And in Frog Holler, when you don't get the full story, you learn not to ask. Small towns can keep secrets real well when they want to. The first time I saw Denny Ray, he was standing out in the rain like it owed him money. Hair plastered to his head, shirt clinging to his bones. He had these sharp green eyes that looked like they'd seen too much, and he didn't blink much, which made him seem even older than he was. But then he reached down and scooped up a frog. Not just any frog, mind you, but Old Bugleneck, the biggest bullfrog in 3 hollers, and grinned so wide you could see the chip in his front tooth. "Gotcha, preacher," he said to the frog. "Now sing me a hymn." I laughed out loud, couldn't help it. That's how we became friends. By the end of the week, Denny Ray and I were nearly inseparable. We built a fort out by the pond, using nothing but sticks, rusty tin, some busted lawn chairs, and our own stubbornness. We called it the headquarters of the Republic of Wet Socks, because no matter what we did, we always ended up soaked to the knees. The walls were held together with twine, chewing gum, and a very specific belief that forts could survive anything if you truly believed they should. If the sun was out, we were catching grasshoppers and racing turtles. If it was raining, we were daring each other to run barefoot across the gravel road or see who could stand under the drain spout the longest without flinching. Denny had a way of making the ordinary feel epic. He could take a tin can and some string and turn it into a jungle phone. He could name every frog by the sound of its croak. And I believed him when he said they recognized us, too. Once, he said he thought maybe frogs had little memories, just like people. They just remembered different things, like which lily pad was warmest, or which moon was safest to sing under. I didn't know if it was true, but I liked believing it. He wasn't all mischief, though. Some evenings, if you caught him just right, he'd get real quiet. He'd sit on that lopsided dock, toes dangling just above the pond water, staring out at the cattails like they were hiding some great truth. That dock was a rickety mess of rotting boards and bent nails, but it was ours. We even carved our names into the last plank. DR plus MT for EVR, though we'd never say that part out loud. "Sometimes I think I was meant to be a frog," he told me one dusk, voice low and steady. They don't care where they came from. Just hop around and sing." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and tossed a pebble into the water beside him. It made 3 ripples, then nothing. Then came the big storm, the one that cracked the old elm in half and knocked out power clear down to the mill. Mama had lit candles in jelly jars and set them along the kitchen windowsill. The house smelled like hot wax, rain-soaked wood, and the cornbread she'd forgotten in the oven. I remember sitting by the screen door, knees pulled up to my chest, listening to the frogs scream into the wind like they had something urgent to say. I kept looking out toward the pond, a growing knot in my belly. Turns out, Denny Ray had taken Earl's old rowboat, the one that barely floated on good days, and paddled himself out onto the middle of the pond with a kite. Said he wanted to see if God would answer back. I don't remember running out the door. Just the cold mud squishing between my toes, the wind tugging at my shirt like it wanted to keep me back, and the thunder splitting the sky like a warning. When I reached the pond's edge, I could barely see him. Just the faint shimmer of lightning glinting off the kite string, and his hunched silhouette against the black water. "Denny, what are you doing?" I yelled, voice breaking. He didn't turn, just said, "Listening." I stayed there until he paddled back. We didn't talk on the walk home. We never talked about that night again. But something in him changed. He started blinking more, started looking people in the eye. And sometimes, when no one else was around, he'd hum to himself. Soft little tunes that sounded half like lullabies, half like frog song. A few weeks later, he was gone. His great-uncle said his folks had written, wanted him back. No goodbye, no warning. Just a note left on our fort. Every frog sings. Some just need rain first. The day after, Mama found a small carved frog in my sock drawer. Walnut wood, smooth and warm to the touch. There was a smile carved onto its little face. I kept it tucked in a box for years, wrapped in a republic flag we made from an old kitchen towel. Sometimes I dream of that summer. Not the heat, not the lightning, not even the pond. Just the frogs, loud and holy, like they were trying to lift a boy back into something brighter. And when I wake up, it still smells like rain. The older I get, the more I realize that missing someone doesn't always feel like sadness. Sometimes it just feels like silence, like a porch step no one sits on anymore, like the smell of someone's soap lingering on a towel days after they're gone. That summer in 1957, I was 10 years old, and it had been just over 6 months since my brother Caleb passed away. He was 15 when the fever came, and sometimes I still catch myself wondering what kind of man he might have been if he'd made it to 17. Caleb wasn't loud like most boys his age. He had a calm about him, like old trees do, like he'd been here longer than the rest of us and just hadn't mentioned it yet. His laugh wasn't big, but it stuck to the walls and made you feel warmer somehow. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and he had this cowlick in the back of his head that made his hair spiral up no matter what Mama did with a comb and a splash of cold water. And when he smiled, the gap in his front teeth made everything he said feel more honest. He had this way of walking, not too fast, not too slow, like he trusted the ground to wait for him. Caleb could whistle through an acorn top better than anyone. Not a regular whistle either. His had depth, like wind echoing through a canyon, or the night train rolling through the hills past bedtime. I used to think he was part bird, the way he could call to things that didn't answer anyone else. And frogs. Well, they listened to him like he was royalty. I once saw him croak at a bullfrog 3 times, and the frog croaked back like they were having a full-blown conversation. The winter he died, the house changed. It didn't fall apart. It just got quieter, like everything was holding its breath. Mama still made biscuits, but she didn't hum anymore. Papa didn't tell stories at the dinner table. My older sister, Ruthie, stopped teasing me about my messy hair and just kept her head down, buttering toast in silence. Caleb's straw hat hung on the back of the door, right where he'd left it the day before he got sick. His shoes stayed tucked by the porch steps, one leaning on the other like they were waiting for his feet to come back. That summer, everything outside tried to move on like nothing had changed. The frogs still sang at night. The rain still came in short, loud bursts that soaked the road and turned the dirt yard into thick mud. The wind still carried the smell of pine and honeysuckle across the fields. And yet, inside the house, every sound echoed differently. Even my own footsteps on the stairs felt like they didn't belong to me. And still, laughter found a way in. I remember one afternoon, the neighbor's goat, a stubborn old thing named Henry, got into our tomato patch and came out wearing a full vine around his neck like a victory wreath. Mama chased him with a broom, while Ruthie tried not to laugh and failed completely. I laughed too, and then felt a little guilty afterward, like laughing was a betrayal. But that guilt faded faster each time, because joy, even small joy, is stubborn. I spent a lot of time that summer down by the creek. I'd skip stones across the water and watch them hop like they were trying to run from something. I'd sit under the same willow tree Caleb and I once climbed together, its long green arms sweeping down like it was trying to comfort the earth. Sometimes I'd climb halfway up and sit there, chewing on sweet grass and watching clouds until they changed into shapes that looked like frogs or dragons or sometimes just nothing. That was the kind of quiet I liked. Not the kind in the house, but the kind where the world just breathed beside you. One afternoon in July, the kind where the sun presses down on your shoulders and even the frogs stay quiet, I climbed up into the attic. The air was thick and slow, full of dust that danced in the beams of light like it had nowhere else to be. It smelled like cedar, old quilts, and forgotten summers. In the far corner under a folded patchwork coverlet, I found the old chest Mama once told me not to open without permission. But no one had mentioned it in months. And something about that day felt like permission. Inside the chest, I found Caleb's old things, things I hadn't seen since winter. A slingshot he'd carved from a bent fork and a strip of bicycle tire. His jar of marbles, smooth and colorful, each one with tiny swirls inside like frozen fireworks. A small tin box that rattled when I opened it, filled with bottle caps, a pocket knife missing its tip, and 2 polished stones he'd once told me were lucky. At the very bottom, folded neatly and tucked between a pair of socks, was a piece of paper with my name written in his scrawled handwriting. To M, in case I go somewhere. I held it like it might disappear. Sat down cross-legged on the wooden floor, heart beating so loud I could hear it in my ears. The letter was short. Just some jokes about frogs with fancy names, a cartoon of me with bug bites the size of dinner plates, and a list titled Rules for Surviving Without Me. Rule 1, don't eat green apples. Rule 2, stay away from Mr. Baker's mule. Rule 3, never forget to dance in the rain. At the very bottom, scribbled smaller than the rest, almost like he wasn't sure he wanted me to read it, was one more line. It's okay if you forget me sometimes. Just remember the laughing parts. I didn't cry. I just sat there in that attic full of dust and sunlight, feeling like maybe he hadn't gone too far after all. That evening, I brought the marble jar outside and made a circle in the dirt. Played a few rounds by myself, listening to the click and roll of glass against ground, the way they spun like planets in their tiny universe. Mama sat on the porch in her rocker, a glass of sweet tea in her hand, and hummed, for the first time in a long while. Neither of us said anything, but I think she knew where I'd been. Later that night, rain came soft and steady, the kind that barely soaks your shirt, but lingers on your skin like memory. I lay in bed with the window open, quilt tucked to my chin, and the frogs singing so loud it felt like they were trying to tell the sky a secret. And somewhere between the croaks and the rustle of the trees, I swear I heard that acorn whistle again. Not from the tracks, not from the yard, from the woods behind the house, like it had been waiting for the right kind of night to come home. I didn't open my eyes. I just smiled and let the sound fill the space between awake and asleep. Caleb wasn't gone. Not really. He was in the jar of marbles, in the slingshot I kept on the shelf, in the breeze that rustled the willow leaves in the afternoon, and the way Mama hummed when she thought no one was listening. That was the summer I thought I'd learn how to let go. But instead, I learned how to carry him, quietly, gently, always. Some rains just fall, get the ground wet, and leave. Others stay a while, curl around the edges of your house, seep into the wood, and whisper things to your heart you didn't know you were old enough to hear. That summer in 1957, I learned that not all tears come from pain. Some of them come from a kind of beauty you can't hold in your hands, the kind that sneaks up on you slow and quiet, until suddenly it's everywhere. I was 10 years old, and until that day, I don't think I'd ever cried from anything other than a scraped knee, a lost marble, or being told I couldn't go outside before chores were done. But that day, that rain, it reached into something soft inside me and showed me how to feel bigger than my own little life. The week before, the rain was dry and mean. That kind of heat that makes even the frogs give up and wait. The ground cracked in long lines that looked like someone had taken a knife to the earth. Our creek, which usually trickled just loud enough to whisper stories when you sat still, had shrunk down to muddy puddles and dry rocks. Mama kept a damp cloth on her neck all day, and Papa started muttering about how he could smell the dust in his bones. Even the chickens walked slow, like the heat was sitting on their backs. The sky had been flirting with rain all week, clouds gathering, rolling in just enough to darken the cornfields, then drifting off without a drop. The kind of sky that makes you hopeful and tired all at once. I'd taken to sitting out on the front steps every afternoon, barefoot and dusty, just in case the clouds changed their mind. Sometimes I'd bring a book. Sometimes I'd just count frogs that had parked themselves near the porch, waiting like me. Then came the day. It was after lunch. Ham sandwiches on white bread and cucumbers floating in vinegar. Mama let me lick the spoon from the sugar jar, and I remember the sweet grit of it still on my tongue when the wind shifted. It didn't blow hard. It didn't roar. It just changed. Like someone had opened a door in the sky and let something real in. The leaves on the pecan tree outside turned their pale undersides up, and the air went still, then cool, just for a second. Even the bugs stopped. That was the moment I knew. I stepped outside, stood on the top porch step, and looked out across the field. The clouds had settled in low and thick, the color of tin and bruises. A hush fell, and the first drop hit the back of my hand, cool, heavy, like a blessing. then another on my cheek, then 100 more. And then, all at once, like God had tipped over a basin, it came down so fast the world seemed to disappear. Normally, I'd run. Mama's rule was always the same. If your shirt gets soaked before you reach the porch, you're drying beans after supper. But that day, I didn't move. I stood there, hands loose at my sides, head tilted back just enough to feel the rain catch in my lashes. It wasn't cold. It wasn't sharp. It was soft. Soft, like the first time someone strokes your hair while you're crying. It touched everything without rushing. The dust on the porch boards lifted in tiny clouds. The chickens made startled noises but didn't run. Even the frogs started croaking like they'd just remembered how. Behind me, Mama opened the door, called out something about catching a chill. But her voice was gentle, and I barely heard her. My heart was beating in a strange way. Not fast, but deep, like something big was waking up inside me. The tin roof sang with every drop. It was a sound I'd heard 100 times, but that day, it felt like a song written just for me. And then, it happened. My chin quivered. My nose stung. My eyes welled up, and just like that, I was crying. Not loud, not wild, just tears falling, quiet and steady, just like the rain. It wasn't sadness. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't even sure what I was feeling, only that it was too much to hold inside. I felt grateful, like the world had finally remembered us, like the trees, the frogs, the house, even me, were being touched by something kind and old. Mama didn't scold. She just came out onto the porch, towel in hand, and sat beside me. The rocker creaked once under her weight, then stilled. We didn't talk. We just listened together, to the rain on the roof, to the frogs singing, to the wind sliding through the corn. I glanced over once and saw that her cheeks were wet too. She wasn't wiping them, just letting them fall. Same as me. The rain didn't stop for hours. It softened, then poured again. It rolled off the tin roof and made rivers through the red dirt. It filled the watering trough and overflowed it. It ran down the steps and soaked our socks and made everything smell like new ground. I don't think I moved until Mama finally stood and said, "Cornbread's ready." Even then, I stayed a little longer, watching puddles form in places that had been dry for weeks. Watch king frogs gather, one by one, as if they'd been waiting for this invitation to sing. That night, I lay in bed with damp hair and warm socks, window open just enough to hear the last drips from the porch roof. The air smelled like soap and earth and something gentle. I didn't dream, or if I did, I don't remember it. But I woke up feeling full. Not of food, not of sleep. Just full. After that, I never looked at rain the same way again. I still liked sunshine, of course. Ut rain became something sacred, something slow, something that spoke a language I didn't have to understand to feel. I'd go out into it, even when Mama said to stay dry. I'd stand still and let it find its way down my shoulders, down my arms, until the weight of everything else got washed away. I told no one about that day, not Ruthie, not Papa, not even my best friend Sammy, who'd spent the week trying to dam up the creek with sticks and old pie pans. Some moments are too quiet to share. You just tuck them away somewhere soft, like an old letter in a drawer, and carry them with you. Years later, when I was grown, I read a line in a book that said, "Sometimes the soul gets washed the same way the land does." And I thought of that day, of the sky breaking open, the way my chest did too, of the frogs praising, the dirt lifting, and the sound of the rain knocking gently on the roof. until we listened. That was the first time rain made me cry. And even now, all these years later, when the clouds roll in and the air goes still, I step out onto the porch. I close my eyes, and I wait, just in case it happens again. Not everything worth remembering lives in photographs. Some memories sleep in boxes, taped shut, half forgotten, and hidden beneath old quilts where no one bothers to look. And sometimes, all it takes is a creaky step and a summer afternoon too hot for anything else, and you find yourself standing in front of the past like it's been waiting patiently just to be noticed. The attic in our house wasn't fancy. Just wide floorboards, thick dust, and the smell of warm wood and old things. The light came through one small window shaped like an eye, and the air always felt heavier than downstairs, like it was holding secrets. I hadn't been up there much until that summer in 1957. Mama said it was where spiders held town meetings, and Papa warned us not to walk too hard or we'd fall right through to the pantry. But that summer, with the days stretching out like melted candy and the afternoons too still for even frogs to sing, I found myself drawn to that attic like something quiet was calling me. I don't even remember what I went up there looking for. Probably a fan, maybe a deck of cards, or a place to be quiet. But what I found was something else entirely. There were 3 boxes near the window, plain cardboard, no labels. The kind that had been taped shut a long time ago. One had Mama's handwriting on the corner, faint and faded, save for later. Another had nothing but a blue ribbon tied loosely around it, like someone once meant to give it away and forgot. The third was smaller than the rest, but heavier. It was wrapped in brown paper with a corner torn, revealing the word Caleb. I sat down on the floor, legs crossed, heart knocking a little louder than before. The first box was full of clothes, not fancy ones, just soft folded things that still held the smell of soap and sunlight. A Sunday dress with a missing button. A flannel shirt I remembered Papa wearing when he fixed the fence. A tiny baby bonnet I'd never seen before, tucked between a pair of woolen socks so small they looked like they belonged to a doll. I held them for a long time, feeling the quiet wrapped inside them. There was something comforting in how ordinary they were. Like these clothes had once been part of someone's everyday world, and now they lived in the shadows of memory. The second box held books, worn paperbacks with dog-eared pages. One was filled with handwritten recipes, each one stained with oil and pencil marks. Tucked inside one was a photo of my grandparents, young and stiff-looking, standing in front of the old church on a windy day. I didn't know it then, but that would become one of my favorite pictures, not because of how they looked, but because of how tightly my grandmother was gripping his hand. Like she already knew the years would be hard, and she wasn't planning to let go. There was also a school book with notes in the margins, written in a looping hand that looked almost like Ruthie's. On one page, someone had scribbled, "Remember to laugh when it rains." I traced the sentence with my finger and smiled, wondering who had written it and what kind of day they were having when they did. But it was the third box, the one with Caleb's name, that made my hands go still. I peeled back the paper carefully, like unwrapping something sacred. Inside were pieces of him I hadn't realized I missed. A frog whistle made from a hollow reed, his slingshot, 2 baseball cards he used to keep in his back pocket, a folded note that said "Private, no snooping, M," which made me smile and tear up at the same time. I remembered him chasing me around the barn with that note in hand, yelling that I'd never find his secret box. Turns out I had, just 10 years too late. There was also a letter, addressed to Mama. I didn't open it. I just held it for a while, wondering if she remembered it was here. If maybe she'd left it on purpose. Some things aren't meant to be read twice. Some things just need to be held. And at the very bottom, under a book of drawings he'd made when we were younger, was a jar. A plain glass jar with a lid painted red. Inside were marbles, maybe 20 of them, each one different. Swirled colors, bubbles, cat's eyes. But also a small note inside, rolled and rubber banded. It said, "Things I want to remember forever." I didn't open it either. I just stared at that jar for a long, long time. It felt like something holy. Then, without knowing why, I took one marble out, a green one with a bright yellow streak through the middle, and put it in my pocket. Not to steal it, just to carry something real back down with me. Something alive from a memory I hadn't visited in too long. And sitting there in the attic, I remembered the last time Caleb and I were up there together. He'd made a telescope out of an old paper towel tube and insisted we were looking at planets through the cracks in the wall. He made me laugh so hard, I dropped my lemonade and blamed the cat. That was just a few months before the fever came. I hadn't thought of that day in years, but there it was again, as sharp as sunlight on wood. When I climbed down the stairs, everything looked the same, but I didn't feel the same. Something in me had shifted, like I'd been let in on a secret I wasn't supposed to know yet. Like the past had touched my hand and said, "Now you understand." That evening, I gave Mama the letter. I didn't say where I found it. I just left it on the table next to her sweet tea and walked outside to watch the sunset. She didn't say a word, but later, when I passed the kitchen, I saw her holding it, eyes closed, lips moving. Maybe she was reading. Maybe she was praying. Maybe it was both. The kitchen smelled like cornbread and something older, like comfort. That night, I put the marble under my pillow. It felt cool and smooth against my fingers, and I dreamed of frogs leaping across water that glowed gold in the moonlight. I woke up before sunrise, holding the marble in my palm, and for a moment, I didn't want to let it go. But I did. The next morning, I brought it back upstairs, slipped it back into the jar, and closed the lid tight. Then I sat by the attic window for a while, watching the dust float in the light, like memories still trying to find a place to land. I whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular. And then I closed the box again. Some people think memories fade, but I think they just hide in boxes, waiting for the right moment and the right heart to open them again. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about the attic more than I expected. Every time I passed the linen closet, I slowed a little, as if the staircase behind it might whisper again. I didn't go back right away. Some places, once touched, need time to breathe. But something had settled in me since that afternoon. Not heavy, not sad, just quiet. Like a knot that had finally loosened. Mama didn't mention the letter. Not once. But the day after I gave it to her, I saw her brushing her hair longer than usual in front of the mirror. She hummed while she did it, a soft tune, the one she used to sing when she rocked Caleb to sleep on the porch. That same night, she set the table with the good plates, the ones with tiny blue flowers we only used on Sundays or when company came. Nobody asked why. We just sat down and ate. And that was how it went for a while. Little changes. The sugar bowl stayed full. The radio was turned on again in the mornings. Papa whistled off key while feeding the hens. And one evening, just as the sun dropped low over the cornfield, Mama called me into the kitchen and handed me a pie tin wrapped in a towel. "Take this over to Miss Adeline," she said. "You could use the walk. And she's been alone too long." So I did. And on the way back, barefoot in the dust, I realized something strange. I wasn't carrying sadness anymore. I was carrying something else, something softer, something that glowed a little, even under the dusk. That night, before bed, I opened my sock drawer and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a button I'd found in the attic. Not big, not special, just a plain little wooden button that must have popped off Papa's old coat. I'd kept it without thinking. But now, holding it in my hand, I knew why. It wasn't just a button. It was proof that things we forget aren't really gone. That time doesn't erase. It simply wraps around, and waits, in buttons and books and old boxes and the echo of your brother's laugh in the corner of the attic on a still day. The next time I climbed those stairs, I brought a notebook with me. Just a small one, the kind you get for school lists or spelling practice. I opened it and wrote one sentence on the first page. This is where time hides. Then I closed the notebook, placed it beside the jar of marbles, and smiled to myself. I didn't need to open any more box. As that day, because I had already opened something much older. Some kinds of lost don't come with panic. They come slow, quiet, like the world has tipped just slightly, and you didn't notice until the trees no longer look familiar. That summer in 1957, I wandered farther than I meant to, and found myself in a part of the woods I didn't recognize. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly small. It started with a frog. Not a surprise, I guess, given where we lived. I'd followed it down past the fence line, across the dry creek bed, and into a patch of shade that looked cooler than the rest of the world that day. I wasn't running, just walking, thinking maybe I'd catch it. Maybe I wouldn't. But the frog kept going, and I kept following. And the next thing I knew, the frog was gone, and I was surrounded by tall, unfamiliar trees, and the strange hush that comes when even the birds pause. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. I knew the woods. We all did. Frog Holler was the kind of place where every kid had their own secret trail. I figured if I turned around, I'd see the old rock wall or the bent pine near the Miller place. But I didn't. I turned around and saw more trees. I walked a little, then a little more, and that hush followed me. I stopped calling out when my own voice started to sound too loud. The sun had dipped lower than I realized. Light came through the branches in broken gold, and the dust in the air floated like slow snow. I sat on a mossy stump and told myself not to cry. I wasn't scared. Not yet. Just off course. That's what I told myself. But my stomach had that twisting feeling, like it does when you know something isn't right, but you're trying to pretend it is. I heard a branch snap behind me. Just a deer, maybe, but I jumped anyway. My throat felt dry, even though the air was thick. I picked a direction and started walking, carefully, quietly, and that's when I heard it. Faint at first, almost nothing, like someone tapping a spoon against glass far away. But then it came again, a slow, steady toll, low, round, and warm. A church bell, one I knew well. First Baptist, in the center of town, the same one that rang every evening at 6, just before supper. I didn't even know I'd wandered far enough to lose it. But there it was again, ringing like a hand stretched out in sound. I stopped, stood still, closed my eyes, and I listened. It came again. Not loud, but enough. And just like that, I knew where I was. Not exactly, but close enough to know how to start. I followed the sound. Not fast, not running, just steady steps over roots and dry leaves, through brush that tugged at my sleeves like Mama used to when I wandered too far. The light grew softer, and I could smell the cornfields not too far off. That smell, warm, green, a little sweet, told me I was close. I reached the back of the Miller fence line just as the last bell rang. The world looked normal again, the same way it always does after you've been scared. Like nothing had changed, even though something inside you has. When I walked into the yard, Mama was just lighting the stove. She looked up and narrowed her eyes, but she didn't say much. Just, "Wash your hands, supper's ready." But later that night, when I was brushing my teeth, she came into the doorway and said quietly, "You okay?" I nodded. "I heard the bell," I whispered. She nodded too, like that was answer enough. That night, as I lay in bed with the window open, I thought about how strange it was that something so ordinary, just a bell, could reach across trees and distance and fear and guide me back like a map I didn't know I had. Since then, every time I hear a bell in the distance, I pause. Doesn't matter where I am, in town, at a funeral, even on the radio. I close my eyes, just for a moment, and I listen. Because somewhere inside me, I still remember what it sounded like the day I needed it most. And that, I think, is what being found really means. Not that someone grabs your hand and pulls you out, but that something, soft and steady, calls your heart back to itself. In the days after, I didn't talk about it much. Not because I was hiding anything, just because it felt too quiet to explain. People asked where I'd been, and I said I'd wandered past the creek. Mama didn't press, though I think she knew. There's a way a mother watches you after something's shaken you, not like she's waiting for you to break, but like she's making space for you to grow. I noticed things differently after that. How shadows moved when the sun shifted in the afternoon. How the wind carried smells from farther away than I'd realized before. Pine sap, river mud, something sweet and hard to name. I started listening for bells, even when they weren't ringing. Sometimes I'd hum the rhythm of them under my breath, like a song only I could hear. A few days later, I asked Papa if I could walk into town with him for flour. It was nothing unusual, just a dusty walk past 3 farms and 1 field of sorghum. But I held his hand longer than I usually did. And when we reached the general store and the church tower came into view, I looked up and smiled without meaning to. That bell tower wasn't much, just old wood and rusted metal, the paint flaking off like brittle snow. But it stood tall above everything else, taller than the maples, taller than the silos. And when we stepped outside with our paper bag of flour and apples, the bell rang again, not because I needed it, but because it was time. And still, something in me settled. That evening, I sat out on the porch steps long after supper, tracing my finger through the dust on the railing. Ruthie was stringing beans beside Mama. Papa smoked his pipe, tapping the bowl gently every so often like it helped him think. I didn't say anything. I just listened. And when the wind shifted, I closed my eyes, wondering if it would carry the bell again. It didn't. Not that night. But I didn't need it to, because the sound was already inside me. It became something I carried, not loud, not constant, just there, like a lantern hung behind my ribs. A reminder that even when the world turns quiet and strange, something steady might still be calling you home. And sometimes, being found doesn't mean someone comes running. Sometimes, it means learning to be still long enough to hear what's been calling you all along. You don't always know when something is the last time until much later. It passes like any other afternoon, slow, warm, familiar, and only when the dust settles do you realize that something quietly said goodbye. The last time Grandpa took the wagon into town, I didn't know it would be the last. But the horses did. and maybe he did too. Grandpa never trusted tractors, said they moved too fast and didn't know how to read the land. Machines can't smell when rain's coming, he used to say, chewing the end of a toothpick, watching the sky like it was telling secrets only he could understand. He stuck with the wagon long after everyone else had parked theirs for good. Not because he was stubborn, though he was, but because he loved the rhythm. The clip-clop, the slow sway of wood and wheel, the creak of leather and rust. He said it was the sound of time moving the way it ought to. That summer in 1957, I was 10, and riding with Grandpa in the wagon was better than any carnival. I'd sit beside him on the sun-warmed bench, the reins loose in his hands, his hat tipped low. He always whistled, not a tune, just a low, wandering sound that dipped and rose with the hills. And I'd watch the world pass by at a pace that let you notice everything. The way the corn leaned in the wind, the way dragonflies hovered near puddles, the way folks waved even when they didn't know your name. That afternoon was hot, the kind that turned the road to powder and the air to syrup. Grandpa slapped the reins lightly, and the horses, Maybelle and Jude, started off with their usual patience. The wagon creaked, and we rolled through the field path, over the narrow bridge, and onto the main road that led into Frog Holler. I remember the way the wheels hummed against the dirt, and how Grandpa's elbow touched mine when he turned to point at the hawks circling the tree line. Town looked the same as always, lazy, sun-drenched, a few kids with ice pops on the store steps, a couple of dogs asleep in doorways, but I noticed people turned their heads when they heard us. Not in annoyance, but in recognition. Like they knew this sound was something they wouldn't hear much longer. A man tipped his cap. A woman smiled and put her hand on her heart. And the bell over the general store door jingled softly, even though no one went in. We bought feed and sugar and a sack of flour. Grandpa picked out a spool of thread for Grandma without even checking the color. Said she'd make it match something. Then we walked slowly back to the wagon, each step as measured as the horse's breath. On the way home, we didn't talk much. The wind picked up a little, enough to stir the edges of Grandpa's shirt and carry the scent of honeysuckle from the fence line. He started whistling again, but this time it had shape, a melody. One I didn't recognize, one I haven't been able to find since. Just before we turned off the main road, he stopped the wagon. Let the horses stand still. The sun hung low and soft behind him. He looked out at the hills, not the road, not the fields, but the hills. And he nodded once, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he turned to me, smiled just enough to lift one corner of his mouth, and said, "Might be time to teach you how to steer next summer." But there was no next summer. That fall, Grandpa got sick. Not all at once, just a slow fade, like colors washing out of fabric. He still came down to breakfast, still read the paper with his glasses perched halfway down his nose. But his hands shook more when he held his cup, his voice soft, Enid. And one morning, I found the reins folded neatly on the porch bench. He never took them down again. The wagon stayed parked by the barn, the wheels lined up with weeds, the seat gathering dust. Sometimes I'd sit in it alone, feet dangling, eyes closed, pretending I could still hear the rhythm of the road. I'd trace the lines Grandpa had carved into the wood. Little notches, some with dates, some with initials. He'd never told me what they meant, but I like to think they were his way of counting time. After he passed, we kept the horses a while longer. Maybelle lived on hay and memory for nearly 2 years, and Jude passed that winter, quiet as snow. Papa said we'd save the leather, maybe fix the wagon. But months went by, then seasons. The wood sagged under rain and sun. The wheels leaned inward like tired knees. Finally, Papa took it apart and used the pieces to build a bench under the pecan tree. Not to throw it away, just to let it rest somewhere soft. Sometimes I sit there still, and when I do, I hear it. That soft creak of the axle, the shuffle of hooves, the quiet whistle curling through dust and afternoon sun. Not loud, not clear, but there, like something too proud to ask for attention, yet too loved to disappear. And I remember that last ride, not as an ending, but as a kind of passing down. Like Grandpa handed something to the wind that day. Not the reins, not the wagon, but a way of seeing, a way of listening to the land, of slowing down long enough to notice things that don't shout. Like the bend in the road where the hawks always fly, or the way honeysuckle smells stronger after rain, or how some goodbyes are whispered through the sound of wooden wheels turning home. It took me years to understand it fully. I didn't become a farmer. I didn't keep horses. But every time life feels too fast, too loud, too filled with things that blink and buzz and rush, I think of that bench, that creak, that smile. And I try to walk, not ride. I try to listen for things without needing them to speak. Because Grandpa's last ride didn't end when we parked the wagon. It ended when I finally realized he wasn't just taking a slow road home. He was showing me how to carry the pace of love. After Grandpa passed, summer didn't stop. The frogs still sang. The tomatoes still ripened on the vine. The air still shimmered above the road at midday like it always had. But everything felt just a little slower, like the world had paused to let him go, and then kept walking, only softer. I'd sit on the wagon bench Papa had made from the old boards under the pecan tree where the shade was thick and kind, and I'd close my eyes and imagine the reins in my hands, the leather warm, the wood humming beneath me, the horses steady and calm. I never actually steered the wagon, but I remember the way Grandpa used to lean just a little when we turned, as if even the corners of the world deserved respect. Sometimes I'd find myself humming. Not a tune I knew, just the shape of one. The one he whistled that last day. And though I never quite got it right, the sound of it made my chest ache in the gentlest way. One morning in late August, Mama found me tying bits of twine to a stick. She watched for a minute, then asked what I was making. "A harness," I said, without looking up. She didn't say anything after that, just went back inside and returned a few minutes later with Grandpa's old hat, the one he wore every summer for as long as I could remember. She set it beside me and nodded, once like an offering. I wore that hat every afternoon for the rest of the season. It was too big, of course, and slipped over my ears if I wasn't careful. But when I wore it, I felt taller, quieter, older. Like maybe, if I listened hard enough, I'd understand the things Grandpa never said out loud. Fall came, and the trees burned orange and gold. The fields emptied. The days grew shorter. I stopped sitting under the pecan tree so much. The wind was cooler now, and the ground stayed damp longer after rain. But sometimes, when the sun broke through just right, I'd still go and sit, just for a minute. Just long enough to hear something old creak in the back of my mind. Years later, when folks talked about the last wagon in Frog Holler, they always mentioned Grandpa. "Stubborn old mule of a man," they'd laugh. But they said it with affection. Could have had a tractor years earlier, but wouldn't trade in those hooves for all the gears in the world. And I'd nod, smiling quietly, because I knew why. It wasn't about the wagon. It was about the rhythm, the clip of hooves, the squeak of wheel, the song of dust behind you, rising like a story told without words. I don't remember what we bought in town that day, but I remember how it felt to sit beside him while the world moved slow and the wind moved gentle and time, just for a while, moved exactly right. There's a kind of table that doesn't just hold plates and silverware. It holds stories, arguments, laughter, prayers, elbows, and jelly smears. And when I think of summer in 1957, I think of that table. Oak, old, loud, creaky in every joint, chipped at every edge, and the heart of our home. It sat right in the center of the kitchen, where the floor dipped just slightly to one side, so the salt shaker always rolled toward Uncle Will. He said it was a sign the Lord wanted him to season more. Mama said it was because he leaned on the table too hard. That summer, it seemed like we were always gathered there, not just for supper, but for shelling peas, slicing peaches, fixing radios, even trimming Grandpa's nails when he didn't feel like sitting still. There were 7 of us most nights. Mama, Papa, Ruthie, me, Grandpa, Uncle Will, and little Tommy, who didn't say much, but could whistle like a bird when he thought no one was listening. Dinner was never fancy, but it never had to be. Fried catfish, if we were lucky, biscuits that clung to your ribs, collard greens that always had a little too much vinegar. We drank sweet tea so strong it could stain a spoon, and passed dishes hand to hand, like passing the offering plate on Sunday. Everything squeaked. The chairs, the floorboards, even the spoons sometimes. But nobody minded. It was music, in its own way. I remember one night, a thunderstorm rolled in just as Mama pulled cornbread from the oven. The windows rattled, and the lights blinked twice, then stayed out. Papa lit the oil lamp. Uncle Will lit 2 more. And we ate dinner in the glow of flickering glass. The thunder muttering like it had something to say, but couldn't quite get it out. Ruthie spilled beans in her lap. Grandpa pretended not to notice so she wouldn't cry. Little Tommy tapped his fork like a drum until Mama gave him the look. Someone told a joke about a preacher and a mule, I can't remember who, and we laughed so hard the table groaned beneath us. It made a sound like a barn sighing. That's when I realized the table knew everything, every secret, every promise, every lie we ever told with a smile. It knew who had kissed whom behind the shed, who'd broken the cookie jar and blamed it on the dog, who cried at night and thought no one heard. Later that week, I carved my initials into the underside with the point of a spoon. I wasn't allowed to use knives yet, but I figured spoons could be just as permanent if you pressed hard enough. I remember thinking, one day someone will see this and know I was here. Funny how children think memory has to be etched into wood when love already does it in silence. As August wore on, the nights stayed hot, and we'd eat supper with the back door open, letting in the scent of honeysuckle and the buzz of cicadas. I'd rest my chin on the table after dessert, listening to Grandpa hum, or to Mama talking low to Uncle Will about bills and harvest and someone's bad back. The conversation didn't need me. It just flowed, like molasses or creek water, slow and sticky and full of little turns. Sometimes I wonder how the table held up under all that weight. Not just plates and elbows, but years and people and growing up. The first time I heard Papa say, "Grace without Grandpa," it wobbled. Not much, just a soft tremor in the legs, like it was grieving too. When we finally replaced it, years later, long after the kitchen had been redone and Mama had moved to town, I asked if we could keep the old one. Papa said it was too far gone. "It's got termites," he said, "and 3 legs don't match." But I watched his hand brush the edge one last time before he walked out of the room. I took one of the slats when no one was looking, sanded it down, carved a small line from the book of Psalms along the side. Thou preparest a table before me. It sits now on my own kitchen wall, above a table that doesn't creak. Not yet, anyway. But every time someone laughs hard, or leans too far, or passes the cornbread without asking, I hear it again. That old table, sighing softly, like it's still with us, just in a different room. And sometimes, even after we'd eaten, we'd linger. Grandpa would push back in his chair with a grunt, crossing one leg over the other, tapping the heel of his boot against the floor like a metronome. Mama would sit there, peeling an apple with a paring knife, making one long curl of skin without ever breaking it. Ruthie would start braiding her napkin like it was a doll's hair. It was that kind of table, the kind that held you just a little longer than you meant to stay. Atil. Saturdays, it turned into a workbench. Papa would open the radio and spread tiny screws across the oilcloth, while Uncle Will looked on, always pretending he knew what was wrong. Once, he tried to fix the toaster with a butter knife and blew the fuse for half the house. Mama was so mad, she slapped a biscuit at him, and he caught it mid-air like it was nothing. That story got told for years, always a little different each time, always ending with that biscuit and the look of and Mama's face. Sunday evenings were slower. We'd finish our meal and sit quiet for a while, the heat of the day trapped under our skin. Grandpa would hum low, a hymn maybe, or something older. I remember once he said, "If this table could talk, it'd tell you who really took the last piece of pie." And Ruthie went red as a beet. We all knew it was her. She always left the crust like it was some kind of alibi. But it wasn't just the food, or the stories, or even the people. It was the feeling. That table made you feel like time wasn't rushing anywhere, like everything important was already here, within reach. You could stretch your hand out and find it. A slice of peach, a warm cup, a familiar laugh. It wasn't just where we ate, it was where we belonged. And maybe that's why losing it felt so quiet. No big ceremony, no real goodbye. One day, Mama just said it was too warped to keep, and that was that. The new table came from a catalog, shiny, level, smelled like varnish instead of cornbread. It didn't creak, it didn't groan, it didn't feel like anything at all. I remember sitting at it the first night, trying to eat stew that didn't quite taste right. Ruthie didn't talk much. Papa kept tapping his spoon like he was waiting for a sound that never came. And Mama, well, she just looked tired. Not the kind of tired from work. The kind that comes when something you love gives out, and you have to smile like it doesn't hurt. Years later, when I had my own place, I tried to build a table like it. Same kind of oak, same square legs. I even made the chairs just a little uneven so they'd creak. But it wasn't the same. Of course it wasn't. That kind of table doesn't come from wood. It comes from time. From moments stacked up like dishes waiting to be washed. Now, when my kids eat supper and pass each other the salt without thinking, I smile. When one of them spills beans on the floor and another one laughs instead of yelling, I close my eyes for a second and see it. That table, right where it always was, dipping slightly on the left, humming with secrets. And I think maybe it's not gone. Maybe when you love something hard enough, long enough, it never really leaves. Maybe it just finds its way into other kitchens, other homes, showing up in the hush before a story. The creak of a chair, the smell of biscuits when the storm rolls in. Some nights I hear thunder, and I swear I see the flicker of an oil lamp across the room. I swear I hear someone say something about a preacher and a mule. I swear I feel my elbows pressing into old oak and someone laughing beside me. And I let it stay, just for a minute, long enough to remember how it felt, to belong to a table that knew how to hold a family together. You didn't just open the attic door in our house. You negotiated with it. It was a reluctant thing, swollen with humidity, paint chipped from years of summers pressing against its hinges. It groaned like it had secrets to keep. And if you were lucky enough to tug it open without waking the wasps or your grandmother, you were in. The pull downstairs creaked like a guilty conscience. I loved that part. It made everything feel a little forbidden, a little sacred. The attic smelled like warm dust, old books, and cedar, plus a faint hint of mothballs that lingered like a polite ghost. Light spilled through the slatted vents in dusty shafts that made everything sparkle like it was underwater. I always felt like I was sneaking into a different world. And maybe I was. The first time I went up alone, I was 9. I had a flashlight, 3 peppermints, and 0 permission. It was a hot afternoon, the kind that made the kitchen feel like a bread oven, and the backyard smell like cut grass and dog breath. Everyone was napping or pretending to nap, and the attic was calling. Up there were boxes, dozens of them, some labeled in my grandfather's handwriting, crooked and stern. Ex-Maz lights, 1948, Mother's quilts, Henry's War. Others had no names at all, just old rope or yellowed masking tape, and a hope they wouldn't be forgotten. I started opening them like I was digging up treasure. One held dolls with cracked porcelain faces and eyes that still blinked when you tilted them, haunted and dignified. Another held newspaper clippings, brittle as dry leaves. Headlines like "Tornado Rips Through County" and "Man Catches Catfish the Size of a Buick." I didn't know half the names, but somehow I knew they mattered. Then I found the box. It didn't have a label. It was just an old wooden crate, smaller than the others, tucked behind a trunk with a broken latch. Inside were things that made no sense together. A baby shoe, a letter in faded cursive signed "Yours, always, M," a cracked harmonica, and a Polaroid of a boy sitting on the hood of a Chevy, grinning like he owned the world. Something about it felt alive, like the box was humming with all the stories it couldn't quite tell. I didn't take anything. I didn't even move the objects around. I just sat there, cross-legged, flashlight aimed at the photo, trying to memorize the curve of the boy's smile. Later that night, I asked Grandma who M was. She stopped stirring her tea, didn't look up, just said, "A girl your Uncle Henry once loved, long before the war." That was all. No details, no extra words. Just enough to leave me wondering who he had been before medals, before silence, before the attic swallowed his box like a stone in a well. I went back often after that. Never told anyone. The attic became my secret museum. Each visit, I'd pick a different box. Some held things I couldn't explain. A pair of glasses with only one lens, a rusty ring of keys with no doors to open, a coffee tin full of buttons shaped like birds. But each one made me feel like I was part of something bigger. Like these lives weren't lost. Just paused, waiting for someone to notice. One afternoon, it rained. Hard. You could hear it on the roof like someone scattering rice from the sky. I climbed up anyway. The light was dimmer that day, and the air felt heavier. I found a box with my mother's name on it. Dorothy, school. Inside were report cards, drawings of lopsided cows, and a love letter from a boy named Carl, who spelled beautiful wrong twice. I held those papers like they might crumble, read every word like it was a sacred text. And for the first time, I saw my mother as a girl, not just someone who made me brush my teeth or folded laundry like it was a competition. She'd had secrets, crushes, bad grades in arithmetic, a handwriting that looped like mine did. I think that was the day I started growing up, just a little. Years passed. The attic stayed, unchanged, waiting like an old friend who never got tired of your stories. By the time I was 12, I knew which boxes held what. I had my favorites. I started calling them time boxes, because that's what they were. Little containers full of moments no one talked about anymore, but that still mattered somehow. Like voices echoing in a locked room. When Grandpa died, we didn't go up there for a while. The house got quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. The kind that watches you. But one afternoon, Mama handed me a small envelope with my name on it. Inside was a key. "You'll know what it's for," she said, and walked away. I ran upstairs like my feet knew where to go before my head did. And sure enough, in the corner of the attic, where the beams dipped low and the dust was thickest, I found a box I'd never noticed before. Small, tied with twine. My name scribbled in Grandpa's crooked print. Inside was a flashlight, the same one I'd snuck up with when I was 9, the batteries now long gone. A peppermint crumbled to dust in its wrapper, and a note. It said, "To the only one who ever listened, keep looking. The world's full of stories." That was it. No explanation, no treasure map, just a reminder. And now, whenever life feels too sharp, too fast, too noisy, I close my eyes and think of that attic, the hush, the smell of cedar, the boxes humming quietly, waiting to be seen. I never took much from up there, just memory, just wonder, and the belief that sometimes the most important things we leave behind aren't the ones we label or wrap. They're the ones someone else will find years later and hold for a minute longer than they meant to. Just long enough to feel that something, or someone, once lived here and loved and mattered. Years passed, and life, as it does, got louder. School, jobs, cities, deadlines, bills. I stopped thinking about the attic. Stopped thinking about boxes full of buttons shaped like birds or love letters with misspelled words. I told myself there wasn't time anymore. Grown-up life had no use for old crates or quiet dust. But one summer, long after the house had been sold, and Mama had gone to live with Ruthie in Alabama, I came back. Not for long. Just a weekend, maybe 2. The new owners were away. They'd given permission. "Nostalgia," I said in the email. "I used to live there." They understood. Or said they did. The attic stairs still groaned. Still made that guilty sound. The air was warmer, thicker, more insulation now. But the light? The light came in just the same. Slanted, dust-speckled, like it remembered me. There were fewer boxes. Some had been thrown out. Others moved. But in the corner, against the same low beam, was my grandfather's box, still tied with twine, though someone had taped it now, too. The paper was yellowed, but my name was still there, still crooked, still his. I didn't open it this time. I didn't have to. I sat beside it, cross-legged like before, palms flat on the floor, listening. And that attic, it still hummed. Quieter now, older, but alive. You don't forget the places that held you gently. You don't forget the smell of cedar and summer heat. Outside, cicadas had started singing. The kind of sound that used to fill our Tennessee evenings like a lullaby, meant oyoe, Nelly for children who didn't want to sleep yet. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I was 9 again, with a flashlight and a secret, and the whole world waiting in a wooden crate. And in that silence, I understood something. These boxes weren't about the past. Not really. They were about presence, about someone stopping long enough to see, to listen, to care, and in doing so, carrying the story forward. That attic isn't there anymore. It was torn down last year to make room for a modern roofline and more storage. I saw the photos online. Sharp angles, bright skylights, no dust, no crates, just space. But in my mind, the old attic is still there. A small square of warmth above a crooked kitchen, filled with boxes that breathe gently when no one's looking, filled with time and light and echoes that sound a little like home. I didn't mean to get lost. That afternoon in July, the sky was that chalky shade of blue that only southern summers seem to manage, soft and hot and wide as forever. I was 10, maybe 11, old enough to know better, but young enough to follow a butterfly past the tree line and not think twice. We'd been out at my cousin Lyle's place, about 20 minutes outside of town, though back then it felt like the edge of the known world. His family had chickens, a dog named Duke, and a stretch of woods that spilled down into a little creek that pretended to be a river when it rained hard. That day, Lyle dared me to find the biggest pine cone in the woods. Said he'd give me his last piece of bazooka gum if I beat him to it. So I went looking, like any boy who believed treasure could still be found under leaves and between roots. The trees closed in fast. One moment the house was behind me, voices calling over each other, someone laughing. The next, it was all bark and bramble, an air that smelled like moss and quiet. I didn't panic at first, just kept walking, telling myself I'd circle back soon. But trees have a way of looking the same when your heart starts beating too loud. The path thinned out, the air got heavy, and the woods began to hush. I remember a bird call that echoed too long, the sharp crack of a twig behind me. And then, nothing. Just my own breath and the far-off hum of the world going on without me. I tried calling Lyle's name, but the forest didn't answer. It just stood there, ancient and patient, watching. I knew I was supposed to stay still if I got lost, sit and wait. But something in me, pride, fear, maybe both, made me keep walking and walking. The shadows began to stretch, long and cool. I slipped once on wet moss, scratched my elbow on a branch, and tried not to cry. The trees whispered, or maybe it was the wind. And then, just as the sun was melting into the trees, I heard it. A bell. Soft. Distant. But real. One long, low note that rang through the hush like someone had struck the heart of the earth. I froze. Listened. Then it came again. Not a cowbell. Not the jingle of wind chimes. A real bell. Church-like. Clear. Holy, even. I turned toward the sound without thinking. Just followed it. Step by step. Like it was calling me home. It rang 3 more times, and then it stopped. But by then, I was close. The trees thinned, and I could see a clearing. And just beyond it, a white bell tower, small and weathered, tucked behind a chapel I'd never seen before. The building looked almost abandoned, the kind of place time forgets, but kindness remembers. There was a woman on the steps. Not young, not old. She didn't look surprised to see me. Just smiled and said, "You came through the woods." Like it wasn't strange at all. I nodded. She didn't ask my name. Didn't ask why I was there. Just said, "Come sit a minute." So I did. We sat on the cool stone steps as the light shifted gold. She offered me water from a thermos. Told me the chapel only rang its bell for vespers, evening prayer. Said the bell hadn't worked right in years, but sometimes, on certain days, it found its voice anyway. We didn't talk much, Just listen to the trees settling, the crickets starting their song, and the breeze moving like breath through tall grass. When I finally said, "I think I'm lost," she looked at me kindly and replied, "No, honey, you're exactly where you needed to be." She stood, dusted off her skirt, and pointed. "That path there, it'll take you back to the road. Keep walking until you see a mailbox shaped like a fish. Then turn left." I nodded, but before I left, I asked her name. She smiled again and said, "Oh, names don't much matter out here." Then she went inside, and the door closed behind her without a sound. I found the fish-shaped mailbox exactly where she said it would be. Lyle was crying when I came out of the woods, said they were about to send the sheriff. Mama hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe. I told them I followed the bell from the chapel, but when we drove back the next day, there was no sign of any chapel. No bell tower, just trees, thick, endless, as if the woods had swallowed it whole again. I never found it on a map. Asked around even. Folks just shook their heads. "A chapel in those woods?" they'd say. "Ain't nothing out there but pine and ticks." And maybe they were right. But I know what I heard. And I remember the sound, low, pure, full of something more than sound. It found me when I was small and afraid and trying too hard to be brave. It led me home. Even now, sometimes, if I walk alone in the woods and let the world quiet down, I can almost hear it again. That single, faithful note. A bell that doesn't always ring for everyone, but rang once, just for me. I didn't tell anyone about the woman on the chapel steps for a long time. Not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, though I suppose they wouldn't have, but because somehow the story didn't feel like it belonged to the world. It felt loaned, like something you're allowed to hold just long enough to be changed by it. Mama kept fussing over the scratch on my elbow, kept saying I was lucky not to have broken an ankle or run into a snake. But I wasn't thinking about snakes. I kept thinking about that voice, hers and the bell's, both sounding like they came from somewhere older than time and kinder than reason. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from fear, from something else. I lay in bed, listening to the wind through the screen window, wondering if the bell would ring again. If it only rang for lost children. If it only rang once. And from that day on, the woods didn't scare me anymore. I still respected them, still brought a stick when I walked through, still wore boots after a rain, but I didn't fear them. Not the way I had before, because something or someone had lived in that silence with me. And when you've once been found in a place like that, you carry the stillness of it in your bones forever. Years later, maybe 15 or 20, I returned to those woods. Not to chase pine cones or prove anything, just to walk, just to remember. The land had changed. There were fences now and signs that warned against trespassing. The creek had narrowed, choked with brush, but I found a spot that felt familiar, not by sight, but by air, by weight. I stood there a long time, eyes closed, breathing. And then, I swear it, I heard the bell again. Only once. A single chime. I turned, heart thudding like I was 10 again, but there was nothing. No chapel. No woman in a faded skirt. Just wind moving through the trees like a memory you almost catch before it slips away again. I never tried to find the chapel after that. Some part of me believed that if I looked too hard, it would vanish for good. That it only appears when you need it. Or maybe when it needs you. Even now, at 65, I sometimes hear the echo of that bell in the strangest places. In the hum of power lines, the clink of wind against an old screen door. the last note of a hymn no one else remembers. And every time, it brings me back to those woods, to that fading light, to the hush that held me like a secret. Some people talk about miracles, like they're fireworks, loud and blinding. But I think the real ones are quiet. They don't shout. They ring once, soft and clear, and change the shape of your soul without ever asking your permission. That's what that bell was. Not a rescue, not a coincidence, just a reminder that the world is bigger than we think, and we are never truly alone in it. They never called it his raincoat. It just was, hung by the door like it had always been there, heavy, olive green, and just a little too big, even for him. It smelled like cedar and motor oil, with a faint undertone of tobacco, the kind that clung to men who didn't smoke but stood near others who did. He didn't wear it often, only when the sky turned that soft, gunmetal gray, and the air got still enough to make you pause before stepping outside. Then he'd reach for it, without a word. I used to watch him slide his arms through the sleeves, like he was putting on a different version of himself. Quieter, slower, somehow even more certain. We lived in a house with a tin roof, the kind that turned rain into music. Summers meant storms, sudden, dramatic, unapologetic. And when the first fat drops began to tap the porch rail, he'd be out the door, raincoat buttoned, walking the fence line or checking the gutters, as if the weather had personally asked for his attention. I was 7 the first time I followed him into the rain. Mama hollered from the kitchen window, but neither of us looked back. I wanted to see what he saw, in the puddles, in the tilt of the clouds, in the way the trees braced for water. His boots made that deep, slow squish in the mud, and I tried to step in his footprints like it was a game. When he noticed, he stopped, turned around, and without a word, pulled the coat open wide and tucked me under one side. It was warm in there, damp, too. Smelled like old canvas and patience. We walked the rest of the way, ere too hip, his arm around me, the storm around us. I didn't speak. Neither did he. But I knew something had shifted. Like the world had opened a quiet door, and we'd stepped into it together. After that, the raincoat became a sort of unspoken invitation. If he put it on, I followed. We never talked about it. It wasn't a ritual, not exactly. Just something we did. Some evenings we'd walk all the way to the back field, where the tree line broke open, and you could see the hills ripple like green waves. He'd pause there, squinting like he could read the weather. I'd ask him what he saw. He'd grunt, one of those non-committal sounds that meant everything and nothing. Then he'd say something like, "It's good rain. It's slow." Or, "The ground's been waiting." And we'd head back. One night, though, we didn't go back right away. The rain had turned soft, more mist than drops. He sat down on a stump at the edge of the field, patted the space beside him, and I climbed up. The coat draped around us both, and we just sat there, listening. To frogs, to wind, to the earth doing what it had always done, soaking and giving and breathing. He told me then about a time when he was a boy, and the creek behind his house rose so high it swallowed the barn steps. Said he spent the night on the roof with his brother, tossing apples at floating fence posts and singing songs they half remembered. He laughed a little, and the sound surprised me. Not because he wasn't a man who laughed, but because it felt like something from a different life. A life I'd never seen before that moment. I asked him if he'd ever been scared. He nodded, said, "Plenty, but fear ain't always a warning. Sometimes it's a signal you're paying attention." That line stayed with me. Still does. The rain eventually stopped. Summer turned to fall. The coat stayed by the door. And then, one August, he wasn't home. It wasn't dramatic. No ambulance, no sirens, just a Wednesday morning, and the coffee didn't smell right. Mama stood too still. The kitchen radio played a hymn I hadn't heard before, and she kept wiping the counter like it would give her a different answer. I don't remember who told me, just that the coat stayed on its hook, and no one touched it. Not for days, not for weeks, until one afternoon, late in September, when it rained. The kind of rain he would have walked in. I reached for it before I knew I was moving, slid it off the hook. It was heavier than I remembered, still smelled the same. I put it on. It dwarfed me. The sleeves hung past my hands, the hem grazed my shins, but it held me, and I walked, out past the porch, down the gravel, into the field. The world didn't say anything, but I listened, and I swear, the rain felt just like him. Years passed. I grew up, left home, moved to a city where rain came straight down in clean lines and never stayed long enough to matter. I kept the coat, folded in a trunk with old books and postcards and a belt buckle he once lost in the garden. There were nights I'd take it out just to smell it. Rainy nights when the thunder rolled low, like it remembered something too. I never wore it. Not until the day my own son turned 7. He stood by the door, watching the sky, and said, "It smells like your stories." I didn't know what he meant at first. Then I saw the clouds, soft gray, the kind that hush the earth. And before I could stop myself, I reached into the old trunk, pulled out the coat, and slid. Tee on. It still fit, looser now, softer in the shoulders. The canvas had thinned, but it still held the shape of him, of us. My boy looked up at me, his eyes wide and waiting. So I opened the coat, just like my father had done, and let him in. We stepped out together, into the quiet. It didn't feel like reenacting. It felt like remembering something my bones already knew. We walked down the street, through the rain, past blinking porch lights and barking dogs. I didn't say much, neither did he, but he stayed close, and I kept the coat pulled tight around us both. When we got to the corner where the magnolia tree stood, he pointed up and said, "It's like being inside a drum." I smiled. He wasn't wrong. Back home, we peeled the coat off together, damp and laughing. The hallway full of wet footprints and something else. Something tender. I hung it by the door, right where it had always belonged. And that night, I dreamed of my father. Not as an old man or sick or tired, but standing in the rain, young, alive, laughing. He didn't wave. He just opened his coat and waited. And in the dream, I walked into his arms again. And this time, I wasn't a child. I was just his son, and I was home. The next morning, before school, my boy asked if he could try the coat on again, just for a minute. I helped him into it, and it swallowed him whole, sleeves hanging, hem brushing the tops of his socks. He turned around once in the mirror and grinned like he knew something I didn't, like he'd seen it too. We didn't talk about the dream, or the drum, or the stillness. But when it rained again a week later, he reached for my hand before I could say a word. "Let's go," he said. We didn't bring an umbrella, just the coat. And as we stepped out, side by side, past the porch, into the hush of another summer storm, I realized something simple and whole. The rain was never really about the weather. It was about belonging. It was about memory. And most of all, it was about carrying someone with you. Not in grief, not in pain, but in presence. That old coat still hangs by the door, and every time it rains, I reach for it. Not because I miss him, but because, in some quiet, sacred way, I still walk with him.